Every catastrophe in history had a moment. One room, one person, one decision that took maybe 30 seconds. What follows is 101 times that 30 seconds rewrote the world. 1. You've been told your whole life that the charge of the Light Brigade was glorious. 600 horsemen riding into legend. Brave men swallowed by the fog of war. Noble sacrifice dressed up in poetry and put on a pedestal. That's the comfortable version. The actual version is that a poorly worded order sent 600 men directly into the mouth of heavily fortified Russian artillery that was never the intended target. During the 1854 Battle of Balaclava, Lord Raglan's written instruction to advance rapidly to the front was handed to a messenger who died in the first seconds of the charge and could never clarify what it meant. Lord Lucan read it one way. Lord Cardigan, commanding the brigade, knew riding down that valley was suicidal and charged anyway, because rigid obedience to an ambiguous sentence felt more acceptable than asking a follow-up question. 278 men were killed or wounded in roughly 20 minutes. The correct target was a different, far less defended gun position on the hills above them. 600 men died because nobody wanted to send a follow-up message asking for clarification. Your office email culture has more blood on its hands than you think. 2. Everyone knows why the Titanic sank. Arrogant executives. A ship sailing too fast through iceberg-filled water. The hubris of calling anything unsinkable. That story is clean and satisfying and almost entirely beside the point. The lookouts in the crow's nest had no binoculars on the night of April 14, 1912, because the key to the locker containing them was in the pocket of a crew member who had been reassigned at the last minute and left the ship with the key still on him. Second Officer David Blair was replaced just before departure and walked off with it without realizing. Lookout Frederick Fleet, the man who first spotted the iceberg, later testified that with binoculars they would have seen it soon enough to avoid it. The ship had 37 seconds between sighting and impact. Binoculars can increase effective spotting range by 50 to 70% in low-light conditions. Fleet survived and lived with that knowledge until 1965. 1,500 people drowned because someone forgot to empty their pockets before changing jobs. The most expensive lost key incident in maritime history, and it still doesn't top your building's parking dispute. 3. You think Chernobyl exploded because Soviet nuclear technology was inferior. A systemic failure of an entire ideology expressed through bad engineering, corner cutting, and the arrogance of a state that couldn't admit weakness. That interpretation lets everyone feel superior. Here's what actually happened. The explosion was triggered by a safety test, one specifically designed to make the reactor safer, conducted by operators who had been awake for over 13 hours, under pressure from superiors, on a shift that was never supposed to run the test in the first place. The test had been delayed 9 hours because the Kyiv power grid needed the electricity, pushing the procedure into the night shift whose crew hadn't been briefed on what they were doing. Operators put the reactor into an unstable low-power state. They disabled the automatic safety systems that would have halted the procedure. When they initiated the emergency shutdown, a design flaw in the control rods caused a catastrophic power surge instead of the intended safe stop. They blew up a nuclear reactor while trying to make it safer. This is the engineering equivalent of starting a house fire while testing your smoke alarm, except the house was the size of a city, and the smoke alarm took 30 years to stop glowing. 4. The story you've been handed about Napoleon's Russian campaign is that the winter beat him. That legendary, cold, overwhelming, even the greatest military mind in European history, nature itself finally finding the limit of human ambition. Atmospheric conditions were not Napoleon's primary problem. Napoleon launched the invasion on June 24, 1812, weeks behind his own planned schedule, primarily because of logistical delays in Poland. That lost time meant his army met the Russian winter on the retreat, instead of being safely back in winter quarters by the time temperatures dropped. He had originally planned to launch in May, giving himself a full summer campaign window. The delays came from the sheer scale of his own operation. Over 400,000 men and more than 1,000 artillery pieces, creating a supply chain that moved slower than his ambition. He entered Moscow in September, only to find it burned and abandoned. His retreat began October 19th. Far too late. Temperatures dropped to negative 37 degrees Celsius. Of roughly 422,000 men who crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned in any fighting condition. The greatest military catastrophe of the 19th century happened because the greatest general of the 19th century couldn't manage a calendar. 5. You filed the Challenger disaster under the dangers of space exploration, a tragic but understandable risk at the frontier of human achievement. Equipment failing under conditions nobody could have fully anticipated. The engineers anticipated them. Morton Thiokol's engineers explicitly warned NASA not to launch the night before liftoff because the O-rings in the solid rocket boosters had never been tested in temperatures as low as the predicted 18 degrees Fahrenheit forecast for launch morning. Engineer Roger Boisjoli had written an internal memo months earlier warning that O-ring failure in cold conditions could cause catastrophic loss of the vehicle. The night before launch, Thiokol engineers presented their data and recommended delay. NASA managers pushed back and asked Thiokol to prove it was unsafe to fly rather than prove it was safe, reversing the standard burden of proof that exists for one very specific reason. Thiokol management overruled their own engineers under institutional pressure. The launch proceeded at 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The O-ring failed 73 seconds into flight. 7 astronauts died because management asked engineers to prove safety was a problem rather than proving it wasn't. Every corporate meeting you've ever been steamrolled in is operating on Challenger logic. 6. You probably learned about the Black Death as an unstoppable biological catastrophe. Medieval medicine helpless against a plague that swept across Europe with the inevitability of weather. Nothing to be done, nowhere to hide. No decision that could have changed it. In October 1347, Sicilian port authorities allowed 12 Genoese trading ships to dock at Messina despite the fact that their crews were visibly dying of a horrific disease. Sailors were covered in black boils, leaking blood and pus. Some were already dead at their posts. The symptom profile was unmistakable to anyone standing on the dock looking at the ships. When authorities finally ordered the fleet out of harbor, it was days later, not immediately, and the pathogen had already done what pathogens do when given access to a dense, immunologically naive population. Within 3 years, the plague killed an estimated 25 million Europeans, somewhere between 30 and 60% of the continent's entire population. Other ports made the same mistake repeatedly as infected ships sought harbor elsewhere, each repetition compounding the first decision. A third of Europe died because harbor officials saw a fleet of visibly dying sailors and thought, let's see how this plays out. 7. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is framed as the inevitable result of overwhelming Ottoman force. A city finally crushed after a millennium of survival, outgunned by the era's largest artillery, brought down by the sheer weight of a rising empire. The Ottomans had been hammering the massive Theodosian walls for 53 days with limited success. What actually ended the Byzantine Empire was a small secondary gate called the Kirka Porta, left unlocked and unbarred during the chaos of battle. A small Ottoman force discovered it unlatched, possibly forgotten, possibly left open for a Byzantine sortie that had not returned, and poured through, attacking defenders from behind and triggering a cascade of panic that collapsed the entire defense. Emperor Constantine XI died in the fighting shortly after. The city that had withstood sieges for over 1,000 years fell in hours because someone forgot to lock a side door. Historians still debate whether it was negligence or betrayal, which is really just a debate about which kind of human failure is more embarrassing, An empire that lasted 1,000 years ended because someone forgot to lock a side door. Your building's security guard falling asleep is operating in a proud historical tradition. 8. World War I gets filed as inevitable, a powder keg of alliances, nationalism, and imperial competition that was always going to explode, with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand serving as a convenient spark for forces that needed no particular excuse. The assassination almost didn't happen. Gavrilo Princip's first attempt that morning failed. A different conspirator threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, and it bounced off, exploding under the following vehicle and injuring others. Princip and the other conspirators dispersed, believing the mission was finished. Hours later, Franz Ferdinand's driver, given new route instructions he apparently hadn't fully absorbed, made a wrong turn onto Franz Josef Street and then stalled the car while trying to reverse direction, stopping it directly in front of Princip, who had given up and was eating at a delicatessen on that corner. Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots from roughly 5 feet away. The war that followed killed somewhere between 17 and 20 million people. 20 million people died because a driver made a wrong turn without navigation assistance. Every bad decision in this video has a worse sequel, and this one is the original franchise with the highest body count. 9. London's Great Fire of 1666 gets taught as a city meeting its architectural fate. All those timber buildings packed together, no real fire suppression, the disaster just waiting for a candle to tip over on the right night. The fire was spotted early. It was reported immediately. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken up, went to inspect it personally, looked at the flames consuming Pudding Lane, and dismissed the situation with words that history has not been kind enough to forget. A woman might piss it out. Then he went back to bed. London's only effective fire suppression technique was pulling down buildings ahead of the blaze to create fire breaks and starve it of fuel. But this required the mayor's authority to destroy private property. No order came. No demolitions were organized. By morning, the fire had too much momentum for the technique to work regardless, and by the time King Charles II himself started ordering buildings pulled down, 13,200 houses across 373 acres had already committed to being ash. London burned for 4 days because its chief executive went back to sleep after a 1 a.m. briefing. The most consequential snooze in British urban history. 10. You've absorbed the Hindenburg disaster as proof that airships were a beautiful but doomed technology, physics and flammable gas combining to produce the most televised industrial death in pre-war history, a machine that was always going to end this way, because hydrogen is what it was. The Hindenburg was designed and built to use helium, a non-flammable gas. The LZ-129 ran on hydrogen only because the United States, the world's primary helium supplier, refused to export it to Nazi Germany under the Helium Control Act. Germany had no domestic helium supply. The Zeppelin Company's chief designer, Hugo Eckener, was deeply opposed to hydrogen and lobbied extensively for an export exemption that Nazi diplomatic failures made impossible. The ship was structurally modified to accommodate hydrogen's different pressure characteristics. Engineers adapting a safer design around a political obstruction. The May 6, 1937 disaster killed 36 of 97 people aboard and ended the commercial airship era before it had any real chance to mature. An entire transportation industry died because of an export embargo. The Hindenburg is history's most spectacular trade war casualty, and it went out in front of a live radio audience. 11. The Library of Alexandria collapsed into one of history's great dramatic narratives. The ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge, wiped out in a single catastrophic fire by a single identifiable villain, depending on which era's historians you're reading and which villain they needed. The library was not destroyed in a single event. It declined through centuries of budget cuts, political neglect, and serial partial destructions that each got blamed on whoever was politically convenient at the time of the writing. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BC likely burned a warehouse of books near the harbor, not the library itself. The institution faced serious intellectual decline after 145 BC, when Ptolemy VIII expelled foreign scholars. Aurelian's attack in the 270s AD damaged the district where it stood. Theophilus's riots in 391 destroyed a secondary collection. By the Arab conquest in 641, most scholars believed the library had been functionally empty for centuries. The single-fire story was popularized by writers with political agendas, blaming Caesar, Christians, or Muslims depending on the author's century and preference. We didn't lose the ancient world's greatest library to one dramatic villain. We lost it to centuries of defunding, which is less cinematic and considerably more familiar. 12. Bhopal. You know the name, and you probably know the broad outline. A Union Carbide plant. 1984. Toxic gas. Thousands dead. Industrial catastrophe in a developing nation. The part that gets softened in the telling is that the plant's safety systems weren't overcome by an unforeseeable combination of factors. They were switched off. The refrigeration unit for Tank 610, which held the methyl isocyanate that leaked, had been shut down since June of that year to save money. The scrubber system designed to neutralize escaping gas was offline for maintenance. The flare tower that would have burned off escaping gas was also non-operational. A water washing system wasn't positioned to reach the relevant vent stack. When water entered the tank, the resulting runaway reaction released 40 tons of toxic gas over Bhopal's densely populated surrounding neighborhoods. Estimates of deaths range from 3,800 in the official immediate count to 16,000 in longer-term activist tallies, with 500,000 people exposed to the gas. 3 backup safety systems were simultaneously offline to cut costs on a tank holding enough poison to kill a city. This is what aggressive cost optimization looks like at industrial scale. The savings were not worth it. 13. Pompeii gets remembered as instantaneous. A city buried without warning under the sudden fury of Vesuvius. No time to run. No time to think. Tragedy arriving from the sky in the span of a morning. Vesuvius gave days of advance warning. The region had experienced a massive earthquake 17 years earlier in 62 AD, and many structures were still visibly under repair when the eruption came. In the days before the August 24th event, minor tremors increased in frequency, a classic volcanic precursor that anyone paying attention to the ground beneath their feet could feel. Wells and springs in the area reportedly ran dry, another signal the system uses when it's building pressure. Pliny the Younger, writing from 30 kilometers away, describes the eruption column being visible for hours before the pyroclastic surges hit the city. Archaeological evidence shows many homes had already been cleared of valuables before the eruption, meaning those who had options exercised them. Those found cast in ash were disproportionately the poor, the enslaved, and those who returned to retrieve property after initially fleeing. Pompeii wasn't a surprise. It was a city that watched the warnings, debated the warnings, and then posed for history's most permanent and most avoidable group photograph. 14. The Irish potato famine gets taught as a natural disaster, a catastrophic crop blight that no government could have prevented at the speed and scale it occurred, a tragedy born from fungus and weather and the hard limits of 19th century agriculture. Throughout the famine, Ireland continued exporting food to Britain. Grain, livestock, butter, all leaving under British policy while people starved. The blight destroyed potatoes. The starvation was a political decision. Between 1845 and 1850, Ireland exported roughly 500,000 tons of food annually, all under military escort, while the Trevelyan-led British Treasury deliberately limited relief efforts, citing free market ideology and concerns about creating dependency. Public works schemes paid wages too low to buy available food. The Temporary Relief Act's soup kitchens were shut down prematurely. Approximately 1 million people died of starvation and related disease. Another million immigrated in 1847 alone. The numbers exist. The food exports are documented. The military escorts are in the historical record. 1 million people starved while boats full of food left their ports under armed guard. The famine was less a natural disaster and more a masterclass in ideological rigidity, dressed up as economic principle and applied to a population that couldn't vote it out. 15. The Bay of Pigs gets filed under bold gambles that didn't work out. A covert operation launched under genuine uncertainty, intelligence failing in the unpredictable way that intelligence does, a president making the best call he could with imperfect information. The CIA's own internal assessment showed the plan had near zero chance of success without direct American military air support. That assessment was not fully communicated to Kennedy, who was told the operation could succeed independently. The CIA's Inspector General's post-mortem, kept classified until 1998, found the plan assumed a popular Cuban uprising that intelligence evaluations showed was unlikely. The Trinidad plan, judged more viable by the agency's own analysts, was replaced with the Bay of Pigs approach, largely for political optics, to maintain deniability. When Kennedy canceled the second airstrike, the CIA understood this would doom the invasion, but did not clearly communicate how completely. 1,400 Cuban exiles were captured. 114 were killed. The United States eventually paid $53 million in food and medicine for the release of survivors. An invasion was launched based on a briefing that omitted the part where it definitely wouldn't work. This is what happens when need to know becomes doesn't need to know we're lying. 16. The Johnstown flood of 1889 killed 2,209 people and gets taught as a tragic failure of 19th century engineering. An old dam overwhelmed by extraordinary rainfall. A sad but understandable outcome from an era before modern structural standards existed. The South Fork Dam had documented structural problems that were flagged repeatedly by engineers for over a decade and ignored for one specific reason. The lake it created was the private recreational retreat of one of America's most powerful private clubs. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, whose membership included Andrew Carnegie and Andrew Mellon, purchased the dam and lake in 1879. Engineers inspected and flagged multiple critical problems. The spillway was undersized, the dam had been lowered for a road crossing, iron discharge pipes had been removed and not replaced, and fish screens blocked overflow during high water. The club made cosmetic repairs. They refused to address the structural issues. On May 31st, 1889, the dam failed. A wall of water destroyed Johnstown below. No member of the club faced legal consequences. Over 2,000 people drowned, so a private club could keep its fishing lake picturesque. The most expensive leisure amenity in American history, and nobody paid $1 in liability. 17. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge, opened July 1st, 1940, was called Galloping Gertie by the construction workers building it. Let that sit for a moment. The workers who built the bridge gave it a nickname that was a warning before the bridge ever opened, and nobody stopped. Multiple engineers flagged during construction that the bridge's shallow, solid plate girder design made it dangerously susceptible to wind-induced oscillation. Leon Moisseff had prioritized a sleek, narrow profile over earlier suspension bridge conventions that used open trusses to let wind pass through rather than push against. Aeronautics engineer Theodore von Karman identified the specific risk of aeroelastic flutter in the design. The undulation was visible and documented during construction. Workers observed it, named it, joked about it, and kept building. The bridge opened July 1st, 1940. It collapsed November 7th, 1940, 4 months and 6 days after opening, when a gust of wind caused oscillations that tore the structure apart while film cameras recorded the whole thing. The collapse directly informed all subsequent suspension bridge engineering standards, which is a very expensive way to learn something that the aeronautical engineer had already said in a report. If your construction crew's nickname for a project is literally a warning, that is not irony. That is a blueprint review in disguise. 18. You probably have the Columbia disaster filed next to Challenger in the same mental folder labeled The Inherent Risks of Space Exploration. Two tragedies separated by 17 years, but united by the same essential narrative of brave people lost to unknowable danger. During Columbia's final mission in January 2003, a piece of foam from the external tank struck the leading edge of the left wing during launch. Engineers in NASA's debris assessment team formally requested Department of Defense satellite imagery to inspect the damage. Mission management denied the request. The reasoning, documented in subsequent investigation records, was that even if damage was confirmed, nothing could be done about it in orbit. A conclusion reached before anyone knew what the damage actually was. What that logic erased was the possibility of a rescue mission by Atlantis, which investigators later determined was theoretically feasible if authorized quickly enough. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board identified the request denial as a critical failure in the disaster's chain of causation. All 7 crew members died on February 1st during re-entry, heat penetrating the damaged wing structure. NASA denied a damage inspection because they'd pre-decided they couldn't fix it before knowing what it was. This is institutional fatalism dressed up as risk management, and it has a body count. 19. Mao's Great Leap Forward gets remembered as a collectivization catastrophe, forced industrialization, agricultural mismanagement, a famine born from ideology applied without regard for how farming actually works. All of that is true, but one specific decision made it worse in a way that should make you permanently suspicious of anyone who tells you they've identified the enemy. Beginning in 1958, Mao designated the Eurasian tree sparrow as one of 4 pests to be eradicated because sparrows ate grain. Citizens across China were mobilized to bang drums, wave flags, and destroy nests continuously, preventing sparrows from landing until they fell from exhaustion and died. Hundreds of millions of birds were killed. What nobody in the campaign's planning room apparently thought through was that sparrows also ate insects, specifically the crop pests that would otherwise consume the harvest. By 1959, locust and pest populations exploded without their primary predator. Ornithologist Zheng Zuoxin warned publicly that eliminating sparrows would cause exactly this outcome. He was denounced as a right-winger and removed from public life. The resulting insect surge, compounded by collectivization failures and falsified production reports, contributed to a famine that killed an estimated 15 to 55 million people. They killed the bird eating the grain and lost the grain to the insects the bird was eating. 20. The Aral Sea used to be the 4th largest lake in the world. You can use past tense because it is now 4 small, highly saline remnant puddles sitting in a basin of exposed toxic seabed. The accepted story is that this was an environmental tragedy of unknowable complexity, the cascading consequences of large-scale Soviet agriculture that nobody could have fully foreseen. Soviet hydrologists calculated as early as 1952 that diverting the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers for cotton irrigation would cause the sea to shrink dramatically. The calculation was not hidden. It was presented to planning authorities and officially framed as an acceptable sacrifice. Internal policy language described the water currently flowing into the sea as being wasted. The Karakum Canal and associated diversions proceeded anyway. By 2007, the Aral had lost 90% of its volume. 60,000 fishing industry jobs were destroyed. The exposed seabed now releases clouds of toxic dust, residue from decades of fertilizer and pesticide application, across a region of millions of people, causing chronic respiratory disease. They drained an entire sea, knowingly, because cotton was more valuable than an inland ocean. The Aral Sea is what acceptable losses looks like from a satellite. 21. The 2003 invasion of Iraq gets defended. Still, as a reasonable decision under genuine uncertainty, the best available intelligence at the time pointing toward a threat that turned out not to exist. A tragic miscalculation rather than a deliberate one. The Downing Street Memo, a classified British cabinet document from July 23, 2002, 8 months before the invasion, states explicitly that the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. The decision preceded the evidence rather than following from it. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency's own February 2002 assessment said it lacked specific information on many key aspects of alleged Iraqi weapons programs. UN Weapons Inspector Hans Blix requested more time and was denied. The aluminum tubes cited publicly as evidence of centrifuge activity were identified by Department of Energy and State Department analysts as likely intended for conventional rockets. A dissent buried in the footnotes of the National Intelligence Estimate rather than its conclusions. No weapons of mass destruction were found. Estimates of Iraqi civilian deaths range from 100,000 to 600,000. The financial cost exceeded $2 trillion. A war that killed hundreds of thousands was launched on intelligence that the agencies producing it had labeled uncertain. This is confirmation bias with an Air Force. 22. The USS Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser that completed a secret mission delivering components for the first atomic bomb to Tinian Island, then set course for Leyte Gulf and was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on July 30th, 1945. 300 men died in the initial strike. The remaining 880 survivors entered the water. They were not found for 4 days. The Navy knew the Indianapolis had not arrived at its destination on schedule. The port director's office logged the non-arrival and took no action, operating under the assumption the ship was under orders not to report its movements. A duty officer who received a late delivery notice filed it without investigation. The specific chain of institutional indifference has been documented in subsequent inquiries. Multiple people received signals that something was wrong, and each found a procedural reason to not be the one who followed up. By the time a patrol plane pilot spotted survivors accidentally on August 2nd, 579 of the 880 men who entered the water had died from shark attacks, exposure, dehydration, and drowning. Nearly 600 men died because nobody checked why a ship didn't show up. The paperwork was filed correctly. The men were not found. 23. Halifax, Nova Scotia, December 6th, 1917, 7:40 in the morning. The Mont Blanc was a French cargo ship, fully loaded with roughly 3,000 tons of explosives, picric acid, TNT, gun cotton, and highly flammable benzol stored in drums on deck. It was navigating the Narrows toward the inner harbor. The Emo was a Norwegian vessel heading the other direction. Both captains believed they had right-of-way. Harbor Traffic Control was aware of the developing standoff and did not intervene. The collision itself was slow. The ships drifted together at low speed in a minor scrape. What followed was a fire that burned for 20 minutes on the Mont Blanc's deck before the ship exploded. The Mont Blanc's crew knew exactly what was in the hold. They abandoned ship without warning the crowd gathering on the waterfront to watch the spectacle. The resulting explosion remains the largest accidental human-made explosion in recorded history. 1,782 people were killed. 9,000 were injured. The largest accidental explosion in history had a 20-minute warning window, and the only people who knew what was burning used it to run in the other direction. History's most expensive failure to shout a warning in North American history, and the crowd watched it coming. 24. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 ended the First World War and is still occasionally described as a reasonable if imperfect peace settlement. Exhausted Allied nations trying their best to establish stability after the most destructive conflict Europe had ever seen. Economist John Maynard Keynes resigned from the British delegation before the treaty was signed, and immediately published a book predicting the reparations would destabilize Germany enough to produce another war within a generation. He was right, almost to the decade. The reparations figure was set at 132 billion gold marks. Germany was stripped of 13% of its territory, 10% of its population, all overseas colonies, and its military was capped at 100,000 men. The War Guilt Clause forced Germany to accept complete legal responsibility for a war that had multiple architects. German hyperinflation in 1923 was partly triggered by reparation payment pressures. Hitler's political rise was built explicitly on resentment of Versailles. He named it in nearly every major speech as a foundational injustice requiring correction. Germany made its final reparations payment in 2010. The peace treaty that ended the First World War was so punishing that an economist resigned in protest and wrote a book saying it would cause the second one. The book sold well. The warning did not. 25. In May 1985, Philadelphia police dropped a military-grade satchel bomb containing C4 and Tovex from a helicopter onto a residential row house in a densely populated neighborhood. This is not a metaphor, a hypothetical, or a historical edge case from a century ago. It happened in an American city, approved at the mayoral level, as a law enforcement tactic against a black liberation organization called MOVE that occupied a row house at 6221 Osage Avenue. The bomb ignited a fire on the roof. Police Commissioner Gregor Sambor and Fire Commissioner William Richmond made the decision to let the fire burn, reportedly to destroy a fortified rooftop bunker. The fire spread to 61 adjacent row houses. 11 MOVE members died, including 5 children. 250 residents of the surrounding neighborhood were left homeless, their houses consumed by a fire their city started and then watched. Philadelphia was later found liable by a jury and paid $1.5 million in damages. Mayor Wilson Goode admitted in every subsequent interview for the rest of his life that the decision was wrong. A city bombed its own residential neighborhood and then watched it burn as a tactical choice. The MOVE bombing is the only time in American history a local government conducted an airstrike on its own city block and called it policing. 26. The Dust Bowl. The drought was real. What you've been told less clearly is that the dust storms were manufactured. Deep plow farming, aggressively encouraged by the federal government and driven to extremes by wartime wheat demand during the First World War, had systematically destroyed the deep-rooted native grasses that had held the Great Plains topsoil in place for millennia. The Kincaid Act and the Enlarged Homestead Act pushed settlers onto land previously considered unsuitable for farming. Wartime demand for wheat caused 5.2 million acres of grassland to be converted to cropland between 1914 and 1919 alone. Native grass root systems penetrated 6 to 15 feet into the soil, binding it against wind. Shallow plow farming left the exposed topsoil with nothing holding it down. When the drought hit in 1931, the earth simply left. The Black Sunday storm of April 14th, 1935, carried 300,000 tons of topsoil across the continent. 500,000 people were left homeless. 2.5 million people abandoned the Plain States. The federal government told farmers to plow the grasslands. The farmers plowed the grasslands. Then the grasslands left. The Dust Bowl was government-sponsored ecosystem destruction followed, with geological punctuality, by the ecosystem's invoice. 27. Fukushima. The earthquake was a natural event. The meltdown was a filing decision. TEPCO's own internal documents from 2008 show that company engineers modeled worst-case tsunami scenarios based on historical records, including the 1896 Meiji Sanriku tsunami, and projected wave heights of up to 15.7 meters. The plant's seawall stood 5.7 meters. The gap between those two numbers is the Fukushima disaster expressed as arithmetic. TEPCO's nuclear division classified the findings as preliminary, and no structural modifications were made to the seawall or to the positioning of the backup diesel generators that cooled the reactors. Those generators were located in the basement. When the 2011 tsunami reached 14 to 15 meters at Fukushima, within the range TEPCO's own engineers had calculated, the generators flooded and stopped functioning. 3 reactors melted down. 154,000 residents were evacuated. Exclusion zones remain in place years later. TEPCO's own engineers calculated the exact height of wave that would destroy the plant, and the company filed the report in a drawer. The most expensive filing cabinet decision in the history of nuclear energy, and the drawer is still being paid for. 28. 2 to 3 million people starved in Bengal in 1943, while British India continued exporting food. The standard framing is wartime complexity. Japanese military pressure disrupting supply chains. A colonial administration stretched thin across a global war. Tragedy arriving from circumstances beyond anyone's control. The viceroy sent repeated cables to Churchill's war cabinet documenting the severity of the famine. Australia offered to donate 100,000 tons of wheat. The offer was declined, with shipping shortages cited as the reason, ships that were simultaneously being routed to other destinations for other purposes. Churchill's own written responses to cabinet papers about the famine have been documented by historians and contain language expressing the view that Indians bore responsibility for their own situation through population growth. The official British wartime position attributed the famine primarily to local factors, including hoarding and speculation, a framing that directed attention away from policy decisions made in London. The Financial Times characterized the famine in subsequent historical analysis as substantially a product of wartime policy choices rather than supply impossibility. 2 to 3 million people starved while their government argued about shipping logistics, inflation risk, and the theoretical causes of famines that were actively happening. Administrative indifference at imperial scale produces imperial scale results. 29. The deadliest aviation accident in recorded history killed 583 people on March 27, 1977, on a runway in Tenerife, and you have almost certainly never heard of the pilot whose decision caused it. KLM Flight 4805 began its takeoff roll without receiving takeoff clearance from air traffic control. The captain was Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, one of KLM's most senior and decorated pilots, the airline's chief flight instructor, the face of KLM's own safety advertising campaigns. Before the roll began, his own flight engineer asked explicitly, "Is he not clear that Pan Am, meaning the Pan-American Boeing 747, still taxiing on the same runway in dense fog?" Van Zanten replied, "Yes," and did not abort. The context compounding his decision included hours of delay due to a bomb at Las Palmas Airport, fuel calculations creating schedule pressure, and fog reducing visibility to under 300 meters. The two 747s collided on the runway. 583 people died. The deadliest plane crash in aviation history was caused in part by the airline's own chief safety instructor not following the clearance procedure he spent his career teaching others to follow. The irony is not abstract. It has a body count of 583, 30, Easter Island. The easy version of this story is that a civilization somehow didn't notice its environment collapsing until it was too late. A mysterious, rapid ecological failure, the forest gone before anyone registered the loss. Pollen core samples extracted from the island's lake sediments show that deforestation was gradual over centuries. The people of Rapa Nui watched tree cover declining across multiple generations. They continued building moai, the massive stone statues that required enormous quantities of timber for transport sledges and levers, throughout that decline. Polynesian settlers arrived somewhere between 800 and 1200 AD. Population peaked around 1250 at an estimated 12 to 15,000 people. The last tree is estimated to have been cut around 1650. Without timber, deep-sea fishing canoes couldn't be built. Without forest cover, agriculture degraded. Population crashed to perhaps 2 to 3,000. Interclan warfare and resource conflict followed. Each generation inherited a slightly smaller forest, made decisions that reduced it further, and passed the diminished result to the next group of people who made the same calculation. Easter Island isn't a mystery about a civilization that didn't see what was happening. It's a case study in a civilization that saw it across 500 years and kept building the statues anyway. History's slowest motion unforced error, one generation at a time. 31. Munich, September 29, 1938. Britain and France agreed to allow Germany to annex Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, and Neville Chamberlain returned to London with a piece of paper and a phrase that has not aged well. The comfortable historical interpretation is that Chamberlain was naive, a war-traumatized leader genuinely trying to preserve peace who simply misjudged Hitler's intentions. British and French military commanders privately told their governments before Munich that Czechoslovakia's fortified border defenses and 35 well-equipped divisions represented a meaningful military check on German expansion. The politicians overruled them. What Britain and France handed over at Munich was not just territory. It was Czechoslovakia's entire defensive line, 264 major fortifications built specifically to hold the border, along with 469 tanks, 500 anti-aircraft guns, 1.5 million rifles, and the Skoda arms factories, which subsequently supplied the German military throughout the Second World War. Hitler violated the Munich Agreement's terms within 6 months, annexing the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. The peace that Chamberlain announced lasted 11 months. Britain gave Hitler a military alliance and its entire weapons manufacturing capacity in exchange for a signature. Peace for our time is the most expensive 11-month promise in European history. 32. The Deepwater Horizon explosion on April 20th, 2010 killed 11 workers and released 4.9 million barrels of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico over 87 days. The largest marine oil spill in American history. The investigation found that BP had chosen a cement casing procedure for the Macondo well that Halliburton, their own cementing contractor, had flagged as a risk. Halliburton engineers calculated in a March 2010 memo that BP's nitrogen foam cement design was unstable and recommended 21 centralizers, rather than the 6 actually used to prevent channeling in the well casing. BP rejected the recommendation on cost and schedule grounds. BP's team then waived a cement bond log test, the industry's standard primary tool for verifying cement integrity, a decision documented in internal emails as a cost-saving measure. The Macondo well blew out. 11 workers died in the initial explosion. The subsequent cleanup, legal settlements, and penalties cost BP an estimated $65 billion. BP skipped the test that would have found the problem because the test cost money, and then spent $65 billion on what the problem cost. The most expensive act of frugality in petroleum history, and the Gulf is still carrying the math. 33. Carthage. You've probably absorbed it as a story of inevitable Roman dominance, the ancient Mediterranean's rising superpower eliminating a rival because that is what rising superpowers do. Historical forces expressed through military action. Carthage had been systematically demilitarized for 50 years before the Third Punic War began. After the Second Punic War ended in 201 BC, Carthage was stripped of its navy, its war elephants, and its overseas territories, and paid a crushing indemnity. For 50 years, it complied completely with every Roman condition. By the 150s BC, Carthage was a prosperous trading city, and its commercial success was the actual source of Roman irritation, not any military threat. Senator Cato the Elder ended every single speech he gave in the Roman Senate, regardless of the topic, with the same 5 words: Carthage must be destroyed. He did this for years until he built sufficient political will for a war. Rome then demanded Carthage relocate 15 kilometers inland, knowing the demand would be refused, to create a legal pretext for conflict. After 3 years of siege, the city of 500,000 was demolished, its population enslaved or killed, and its agricultural land destroyed. Rome destroyed the most successful trading city in the Mediterranean, because one senator kept ending every speech the same way until everyone agreed with him. 34. The Mars Climate Orbiter cost $327.6 million. NASA lost it on September 23, 1999, because Lockheed Martin's engineering team was transmitting thruster force data in pound force seconds, and NASA's navigation team was reading that data as Newton seconds. A pound force second is approximately 4.45 times larger than a Newton second. That difference accumulated across 286 days of flight, nudging the spacecraft incrementally off course until it approached Mars at the wrong trajectory angle and either burned up in the Martian atmosphere or skipped off into space, depending on which endpoint the physics produced. Both outcomes cost the same amount of money. The unit mismatch was not invisible. Navigation data showing the discrepancy had been visible in the system for weeks before the spacecraft reached Mars. It was not investigated. NASA's own review board described the failure as a process failure rather than a technical one, which is the kind of precise institutional language that means we had the information and did not look at it carefully enough. NASA lost a $328 million spacecraft because two engineering teams used different units and nobody checked. The most expensive unit conversion error in human history, catchable by any analyst with a calculator, and 20 minutes. 35. The Rwandan genocide killed between 500,000 and 800,000 people in approximately 100 days beginning April 6, 1994, and the framing you've likely absorbed is that it exploded with a speed and ferocity the international community couldn't have predicted or contained in time. UN Force Commander General Romeo Dallaire sent a detailed fax to UN headquarters on January 11, 1994, 3 months before the genocide began, describing weapons caches, militia training lists, and a specific plan to exterminate Tutsi civilians in Kigali. He named a high-level informant. He requested permission to raid the weapons. The response from UN Undersecretary General Kofi Annan's office instructed Dallaire to take no action and instead share the intelligence with Rwandan President Habyarimana, one of the architects of the plan Dallaire had just described. When the genocide began, UN peacekeepers on the ground were ordered not to intervene. The fax is not disputed. Its contents are documented. The response it received is documented. The UN had a 3-month warning, a weapons list, a specific request for authorization, and responded by advising the commander to tell the people planning the massacre that the UN was aware of it. Institutional failure at its most complete and most geometric. 36. The Great Molasses Flood of January 15, 1919, sent a wave of molasses approximately 25 feet high and 160 feet wide through Boston's North End at 35 miles per hour, destroying buildings, killing 21 people, and injuring 150 others. The storage tank that failed had been leaking since the day it was first filled in 1915. Local residents in the neighborhood collected molasses that seeped from the tank's seams as a routine matter. It was a known and observed condition. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was aware the tank leaked. Supervisors considered it a minor nuisance rather than a structural warning. The company's response to the visible leakage was to paint the tank brown, the color of molasses, so that the stains running down its sides would be less visible to anyone looking at it. The tank had never been hydrostatically tested before being filled, standard engineering practice that would have identified the structural inadequacy immediately. It held 2.3 million gallons when it failed. A company concealed a leaking industrial tank by painting it the color of the leak. The Boston molasses flood is what creative problem solving looks like when the solution is aesthetics applied to a structural failure. 37. The Irish Crown Jewels, technically the regalia of the Order of St. Patrick, valued at £40,000 in 1907, were stolen from Dublin Castle in what sounds like a sophisticated heist against one of the most secure facilities in the British Isles. The safe containing the jewels didn't fit in the strong room. That is where the story begins and essentially ends. The lock on the strong room door was incompatible with the safe, so the safe was kept in an outer office instead. The building's front door lock was so worn that it could reportedly be opened by various keys that were not the correct key. Ulster King of Arms. Sir Arthur Vickers held the only combination to the safe, but was reported to have been intoxicated at a party on the night the jewels were last confirmed present. The theft was discovered July 6, 1907, days before a royal visit. The jewels have never been recovered. No one was ever prosecuted. The building that housed the Irish crown jewels had a safe that didn't fit the vault, kept in an unlocked office, behind a door that multiple keys could open. This is not a heist. This is a building that was holding a sign that said please, and someone eventually said thank you. 38. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in April 1982, and the story typically gets told as a territorial dispute. Complex geopolitical history, long-standing sovereignty disagreement, a military junta making an aggressive move. What the junta was actually doing was reading British defense budget documents and concluding from them that Britain had lost interest in the South Atlantic. Britain's 1981 Defense Review proposed scrapping HMS Endurance, the only Royal Navy vessel in the South Atlantic, and reducing the overall naval presence in the region. Argentine Admiral Jorge Anaya cited these signals explicitly in the planning documents for the invasion. The junta had received no clear red line from the Thatcher government and interpreted procurement decisions as diplomatic communications, which is a significant analytical error when the person whose intentions you're misreading has a domestic political situation that makes a military response enormously convenient. Thatcher's political position before the war was weak. The war transformed it. Britain assembled a task force of 127 ships. The islands were retaken in 74 days. 649 Argentine and 255 British military personnel died. Argentina started a war by reading defense budget cuts as a message about political will. Military adventurism based on interpreting procurement decisions is a reliable method for finding out exactly how wrong you were. 39. The Banqiao Dam failure on August 8, 1975, killed an estimated 171,000 people in the immediate flood, with famine and disease in its aftermath killing somewhere between 90,000 and 230,000 more. The Chinese government classified the disaster as a state secret until the 1990s. What was classified along with it was the story of hydrologist Chen Xing, who was removed from the dam design project in the 1950s after warning that the dam network lacked sufficient sluice gates to manage flood discharge safely. Chen recommended 12 sluice gates for Banqiao Dam. 5 were built. He was labeled a right-wing opportunist for insisting on the additional safety measures and removed from the project. When Typhoon Nina stalled over Henan Province in August 1975 and delivered a year's worth of rainfall in 24 hours, the inadequate drainage capacity meant water accumulated faster than it could be released. The Banqiao Dam failed at 1 in the morning. 61 additional dams failed in Cascade. A flood wave 10 kilometers wide traveled downstream at 50 kilometers per hour. A dam engineer was fired for wanting more drain holes. The dam drained anyway, without the holes, and took more than 200,000 people with it. Budget concerns are not a substitute for hydrology. 40. 146 workers died in 18 minutes on March 25, 1911, when fire broke out in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building in Manhattan. The building had fire escapes. The building had stairwells. Workers trying to reach them found doors that would not open because the factory owners had locked the exits during working hours to prevent theft of fabric scraps and unauthorized breaks. The practice was documented in survivor testimony and confirmed by physical evidence. The 9th floor stairwell door was found padlocked after the fire. Workers who could not reach the fire escape or the elevator, which stopped working, jumped from the windows. 146 people died in the time it takes to watch a television episode. Owners Isaac Harris and Max Blanc were acquitted of manslaughter charges. They were subsequently fined $25 per victim in a civil suit, a total of $75 for the 3 deaths covered by the statute of limitations. The disaster directly catalyzed the New York Factory Investigating Commission and became the foundation of American labor safety law. 146 people died because employers locked the emergency exits to prevent fabric theft. American labor law was written in ash, and the men who turned the key walked free. 41. The Swedish warship Vasa set sail from Stockholm on August 10, 1628, traveled approximately 1,300 meters, caught a gust of wind, heeled over, took water through its open cannon ports, and sank in the harbor, while King Gustav II Adolf watched from shore. Hours before the launch, Admiral Claes Fleming personally observed a stability test in which 30 men ran back and forth across the deck to simulate rocking conditions. After 3 passes, the ship was rolling so violently the test was stopped before it could be completed. Fleming observed this. He ordered the test halted. He chose not to delay the launch, reportedly unwilling to be the person who told the king the ship he had personally insisted upon redesigning was dangerously unstable. The ship's proportions had been altered during construction, when Gustav ordered a second gun deck added without the hull being redesigned to compensate for the additional top weight. Everyone involved understood the problem. Nobody wanted to own the conversation. They ran a test that showed the ship would sink, stopped the test because it was too frightening to finish, and then launched the ship. The Vasa is now preserved in a Stockholm museum. History's most expensive monument to the institutional difficulty of delivering bad news upward. 42. The Donner Party departed for California in the spring of 1846 with a guidebook recommendation for a shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff and a warning from a frontiersman named James Clyman not to take it. Clyman had just come the other way. He had crossed the cutoff on foot and described it specifically and explicitly as impassable for wagons. He met George Donner's group in May 1846 and told them directly. They pressed on anyway, trusting the guidebook written by Lansford Hastings, who had promoted the cutoff without having traveled the specific terrain with wagons himself. The cutoff added roughly 125 miles to the journey instead of saving distance as advertised. The group spent 18 days crossing 36 miles of Utah salt desert, losing draft animals and wagons to the conditions. They arrived at the Sierra Nevada 6 weeks behind schedule. Early snowfall on October 28th, weeks ahead of historical average, trapped them. Of 87 party members, 42 died. Survivors resorted to consuming the dead to survive. The Donner Party took travel advice from a guidebook written by a man who hadn't been there, against the explicit warning of someone who had just come from there and said, "Turn around." This is what happens when you prefer the optimistic brochure over the person covered in trail dust telling you not to go. 43. Srebrenica was a designated United Nations safe area in July 1995. Approximately 400 lightly armed Dutch UN peacekeepers, known as Dutch Bat, were stationed there as a protective presence. When Ratko Mladic's forces entered on July 11th, Dutch Bat commander Tom Karamans requested NATO air support. The request was delayed and then canceled through the UN chain of command for procedural reasons related to paperwork compliance. Dutch soldiers were photographed in the company of Mladic. Some received a bottle of brandy from him. Dutch Bat personnel cooperated with the separation of Bosniak men and boys from the refugee population, operating under reassurances that evacuees would be treated as prisoners of war. Approximately 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were executed over several subsequent days, the largest mass murder in Europe since the Second World War. The Netherlands' highest court ruled in 2019 that the Dutch state bore partial legal responsibility for the deaths. The UN had designated the area safe. The peacekeepers present requested the military support that would have made that designation meaningful and were denied through a process that prioritized procedural compliance over the massacre happening in front of it. Srebrenica is what happens when bureaucracy operates as the primary decision-making framework during a genocide. The paperwork was in order. 8,000 people were not. 44. The Spanish-American War of 1898 gets taught as a response to the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, an unprovoked military event that forced congressional action, a genuine provocation requiring a genuine response. The explosion's cause has never been definitively established as Spanish action. A 1976 analysis by Admiral Hyman Rickover concluded an internal coal bunker explosion was the more probable cause. What is established is that William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal ran the headline announcing Spain's guilt the day after the explosion, without any supporting evidence, and that Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer had been running a months-long sensationalist competition for circulation using Cuban unrest as content. Hearst reportedly cabled his artist Frederick Remington, who had reported Cuba was quiet. "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Congress declared war in April 1898. As a direct result, Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. An empire lost 4 territories partly because 2 newspaper proprietors needed to outsell each other in the New York market. The Maine's explosion provided the headline. The war had been written before the ship sank. The Spanish-American War may be the most consequential circulation competition in the history of publishing, and Spain paid for the subscription. 45. The Mary Rose was Henry VIII's flagship, one of the most powerful warships in the English fleet, and it sank on July 19, 1545, during a battle with a French fleet in the Solent, while the king watched from the shore. The most widely supported explanation, drawn from the ship's subsequent archaeological record, is that the Mary Rose heeled to starboard during a maneuver in a sudden wind gust, and water entered through open gun deck ports that had not been closed after firing. The lower gun deck ports sat approximately 16 inches above the waterline when the ship was fully upright. When the ship heeled, that margin disappeared. Water flooded the lower decks. The ship sank in under a minute. An estimated 400 to 700 men were aboard. Most were trapped below decks or pinned by netting stretched across the deck to prevent enemy boarding, which with grim efficiency also prevented escape. The ship was raised in 1982 and is preserved in Portsmouth as a permanent exhibit. The Mary Rose sank in the middle of a battle because gun ports were not closed after firing, a procedural failure so elementary it belongs in the first lesson of naval operations. Operational checklists exist for a reason, and ignoring them has been a maritime tradition since 1545. 46. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is commonly understood as the accumulated result of individual human littering, millions of people carelessly discarding plastic that eventually washes into the ocean, a tragedy of personal irresponsibility scaled to oceanic dimensions. A 2018 Ocean Cleanup Foundation study found that fishing nets and equipment comprised 46% of the patch by weight. 5 Asian river systems account for an estimated 35 to 45% of all plastic entering the ocean globally from land-based sources, regions where industrial plastic waste lacks adequate waste management infrastructure. The consumer responsibility framing has a documented origin. The Keep America Beautiful campaign, founded in 1953 and funded by beverage and packaging companies, popularized the litterbug concept and the crying Native American advertisement specifically to shift cultural attention from producer responsibility to individual behavior. Recycling infrastructure globally handles less than 10% of all plastic ever produced. The industry spent 70 years building products that cannot be recycled, lobbying against regulations that would require them to be, and funding campaigns that told you the problem was your personal habits. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is not a monument to individual carelessness. It is a PR campaign with geography, and the ocean is holding the receipts. 47, Baghdad, 1258 AD. The Mongol forces of Hulagu Khan besieged and sacked the Abbasid capital, destroying the House of Wisdom. a library and research institution that had accumulated centuries of Greek, Persian, and Arabic scholarship, in an act of cultural destruction so complete that Persian historian Al-Juzjani described books thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water ran black with ink. The standard framing is unstoppable Mongol conquest, the Islamic world's greatest intellectual center overwhelmed by an irresistible military force. The fall of Baghdad was substantially enabled by the Abbasid vizier Ibn al-Alqami, who reportedly opened negotiations with Hulagu and deliberately misled Caliph al-Mustasim about the size and intentions of the approaching Mongol force. The Caliph had been warned by multiple advisors to send tribute and seek accommodation. He refused. When the city fell on February 10, 1258, al-Mustasim was executed. Estimates of the dead range from 90,000 to 1 million. The House of Wisdom, containing centuries of irreplaceable accumulated human knowledge, was destroyed. One of history's greatest libraries burned partly because a chief minister was tired of his employer. The destruction of the ancient world's most advanced center of knowledge came with an inside job discount, and the discount cost civilization several centuries of scholarship. 48. The boundary dividing British India into India and Pakistan at independence in August 1947 was drawn by Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never visited India before July 8, 1947, the day he arrived to begin the work. Indian independence was scheduled for August 15th. That gave Radcliffe approximately 5 weeks. He chaired 2 simultaneous boundary commissions, one for Punjab and one for Bengal, working from maps and census data in near isolation to prevent lobbying by interested parties. The final boundary awards were published August 17th, 2 days after independence had already been declared, meaning millions of people became citizens of new countries before anyone officially told them which country they were now in. An estimated 10 to 20 million people were displaced in the months following. Between 200,000 and 2 million people died in the communal violence that accompanied partition. Radcliffe burned his working papers after completing the assignment and never returned to India. He accepted no payment for the work. A lawyer who had never visited a country drew a line through it in 5 weeks that displaced 20 million people, destroyed his own notes, and left. The partition of India is what happens when we'll sort out the details later is not a sentence about paperwork, but about 2 nations. 49. Challenger's O-ring problem was not discovered the night before launch. It was in NASA's own database for years. The 7 crew members who died on January 28, 1986, did not die because of an unknown technical failure. They died because a known technical failure had been classified as acceptable and reflown repeatedly. Engineer Roger Boisjoli's July 1985 memo, 7 months before the accident, warned in explicit language that O-ring failures could cause catastrophic loss of human life. NASA's problem tracking system showed O-ring damage had been observed on 9 previous cold weather shuttle flights. A 1977 internal study had identified the joint design as a criticality 1 issue, meaning failure would cause loss of vehicle, but classified it as an acceptable risk through a process called waiving. NASA had accepted 748 waivers on Challenger's final flight. The Rogers Commission found that the risk had been visible, documented, and repeatedly approved for continued flight rather than addressed. The problem that destroyed Challenger was in NASA's own database, labeled acceptable. They did not lack information. They had categorized the information into a classification that made it someone else's problem and reflew the vehicle. Challenger failed because of what NASA had decided they could live with, and the crew could not. 50, 3 Mile Island, March 28, 1979. A feed water pump failed, a relatively routine initiating event in nuclear operations. A pilot-operated relief valve opened to release pressure and then stuck open. The valve's indicator light showed closed because it indicated whether the valve had been commanded to close, not whether it had actually done so. Operators saw pressurizer water level rising and incorrectly concluded the reactor had too much coolant, a condition called going solid that was considered dangerous. Acting on that misreading, they reduced emergency cooling water injection to the reactor core. For over 2 hours, operators were actively fighting the emergency cooling system while the core was losing coolant and approaching meltdown. A partial meltdown of 45% of the reactor core occurred. No deaths resulted directly from the accident. The cleanup took 14 years and cost $1 billion. The evacuation of surrounding communities caused significant and documented public health consequences from stress and disruption. Operators turned off the nuclear safety system because they believed too much safety was happening, while the reactor was melting down from not enough of it. 3 Mile Island is a demonstration that a wrong instrument reading, combined with competent, well-intentioned action in the wrong direction, costs $1 billion and produces a decade and a half of cleanup work. 51. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is charming precisely because of its lean, and the story attached to it implies a certain helpless architectural accident. Builders who couldn't have known, ground that gave way unexpectedly, a quirk of history becoming a landmark of tourism. Construction began in 1173 on the south bank of the Arno River, where the soil was documented alluvial deposit, compressible clay, fine sand, and shells entirely unsuitable for supporting a heavy marble structure. The tilt began after the first 3 stories were completed in 1178. Construction was halted, not to investigate or address the lean, but because of military conflicts between Pisan city-states that had nothing to do with structural engineering. When construction resumed in 1272, 94 years later, builders actually made the upper floors on the south side slightly taller to compensate for the tilt visually, which added weight to the side that was already sinking. They did this again when construction resumed in 1319. The tower weighs 14,500 metric tons and took nearly 2 centuries to complete, each phase of construction conducted in full awareness that the previous phase had produced a leaning building. A 21st century stabilization project removed 70 metric tons of soil from the north side to correct what 1178 had started. They noticed the problem after 3 floors and built 7 more anyway. 52. You've probably filed Prohibition-era deaths from bootleg alcohol under tragic but predictable, desperate people drinking poorly made spirits in an unregulated black market, a sad outcome of underground commerce that nobody in government particularly wanted. The United States federal government deliberately ordered industrial alcohol to be poisoned with toxic additives including methanol, kerosene, and chloroform as a policy deterrent to drinking, with full awareness that people were consuming it. The Treasury Department's denaturing program expanded dramatically during Prohibition. By 1926, the standard formula for industrial denatured alcohol included methanol, benzene, cadmium, iodine, gasoline, and brucine, a cocktail of toxins added specifically to make the product lethal if ingested. The government knew bootleggers were redistilling industrial alcohol for consumption. New York City's chief medical examiner Charles Norris and toxicologist Alexander Gettler published their findings publicly, calling the policy deliberate murder and presenting documented death counts to major newspapers. In 1926 alone, 1,200 New Yorkers were injured by poisoned alcohol and 400 died. Government officials, including the Prohibition Commissioner, publicly defended the policy, arguing that people who drank illegal alcohol deserved the consequences they received. The U.S. government poisoned the alcohol supply, watched 10,000 people die, and filed it under deterrent strategy. Prohibition didn't just fail to stop drinking. It actively killed the drinkers as official policy. 53. The 1976 Tangshan earthquake killed somewhere between 240,000 and 650,000 people, the deadliest earthquake of the 20th century. And the framing it receives is one of unavoidable natural catastrophe, a massive seismic event striking in the night without warning. Chinese scientists had identified precursor signals in the days before the July 28th quake. Abnormal animal behavior, groundwater changes, and electromagnetic anomalies consistent with pre-seismic stress accumulation. Local officials who tried to act on warnings were overruled by national authorities who had been criticized previously for false alarms, when predicted earthquakes did not materialize on schedule. The political cost of a wrong prediction had been established. The institutional preference was silence. One county adjacent to Tangshan acted differently. Qinglong County received warnings from a local seismologist named Wang Chengming, who presented his data to county authorities. The county organized an informal public warning, and most residents slept outdoors on the night of July 27th. When the 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck at 3:42 in the morning, Qinglong lost one person to building collapse. Tangshan, with a comparable population and similar construction, lost upward of 240,000 in the same minutes. Two counties, one earthquake, one night. The difference between them was a decision about whether to tell people. 54. The Brix Minerals scandal convinced major mining companies, institutional investors, and the entire financial press that a small Canadian exploration company had discovered the world's largest gold deposit in the jungles of Borneo. 200 million ounces of gold, worth approximately 6 billion Canadian dollars at peak valuation. The fraud was sustained using a technique so elementary it is the first method discussed in every mining geology textbook on sample falsification. Salting, the addition of external gold to core samples before assay. Chief Geologist Michael de Guzman was obtaining gold from local river panning operations and adding it to the drill samples that were submitted for analysis. The fraud ran from 1993 to 1997. Multiple due diligence reviews were conducted by major mining companies, including Freeport-McMoRan, which identified anomalies in the data. The stock's upward momentum discouraged the kind of sustained skeptical scrutiny that the anomalies warranted. When Freeport's independent drilling found virtually no gold in March 1997, de Guzman allegedly fell from a helicopter over the Borneo jungle before the results were published. The stock became worthless within days. Investors lost approximately 3 billion Canadian dollars. The world's most celebrated gold discovery was faked with a gold pan. Everyone stopped asking questions because the number kept going up, which is also what happens in every other financial disaster before it stops. 55. The 1969 Cuyahoga River fire is remembered as a shocking environmental wake-up call. A river-catching fire so unprecedented and alarming that it galvanized the American environmental movement and led directly to the Clean Water Act of 1972. The Cuyahoga River had caught fire at least 12 times before 1969, including a 1952 fire that caused $1.5 million in damage. The 1969 fire lasted approximately 30 minutes and caused roughly $50,000 in damage, small by the river's own historical standards. It became nationally significant because Time magazine's June 1969 story ran with a dramatic photograph that was taken during the 1952 fire, which was considerably more visually striking than what actually burned in '69. The story's publication coincided with Earth Day organizing and a period of heightened public environmental awareness, giving it the political impact that previous, larger fires on the same river had never generated. The river had been burning for a century. Nobody passed landmark environmental legislation after the first 12 fires. The Cuyahoga River's most consequential fire was the one that barely burned, made famous by a photograph from a different year. What changed wasn't the river. What changed was the timing and the picture. 56. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as a triumph of rational leadership. Kennedy and Khrushchev stepping back from the nuclear brink through careful diplomacy, proof that deterrence works when decision-makers communicate clearly and keep their nerve. While those negotiations were happening, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was being depth-charged by U.S. Navy forces in the Atlantic. The submarine had been out of radio contact for days, and its crew did not know whether war had already begun. Captain Valentin Savitsky, believing they were under attack and that nuclear conflict was underway, ordered the submarine's nuclear-armed torpedo armed and prepared for launch. Soviet protocol required authorization from 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. The captain ordered it. The political officer agreed. Flotilla commander Vasily Arkhipov refused. The submarine surfaced. Arkhipov's refusal was not publicly known until the 40th anniversary conference in 2002, when Thomas Blanton of the National Security Archive stated that Arkhipov had saved the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved by diplomacy between heads of state, and also by one naval officer saying no in a depth-charged submarine. The scariest moment of the Cold War was not in the White House Situation Room. It was 3 men in an underwater vessel, and 1 vote was the margin. 57, the General Slocum was a passenger steamboat carrying approximately 1,358 people, mostly German-American women and children from St. Mark's Lutheran Church on a summer excursion, when it caught fire on June 15, 1904, in New York's East River. The life jackets had last been formally inspected in 1891, 13 years before the fire. When passengers put them on and entered the water, the cork inside had crumbled with age, and the canvas had rotted, causing the jackets to fill with water and pull wearers under, rather than supporting them. Fire hoses deployed by crew burst because they had never been properly maintained. Life preservers were found strapped so tightly in their holders that passengers could not remove them in the time available. The Steamship Inspection Service had certified the vessel as safe. 1,021 people died. Captain William Van Schaik was convicted of criminal negligence. Every safety device on the General Slocum was either rotted, rusted, or physically inaccessible, and the vessel had a current safety certification. The deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in New York history was a compliance form with a body count attached. The inspectors signed off. The cork had been dust for years before anyone checked what they were signing off on. 58. Hernán Cortés is credited with conquering the Aztec Empire with a force of roughly 900 Spaniards, a military achievement so disproportionate that it has been attributed to tactical genius, technological superiority, and the psychological shock of European contact. The decisive factor was smallpox, which Cortés's forces carried without knowing it, and which killed an estimated 50 to 90% of the Mexica population before and during the siege of Tenochtitlan, without anyone on either side understanding what was happening or why. Smallpox arrived in Mexico with a slave from a Spanish expedition from Cuba in 1520. It spread to Tenochtitlan before the final Spanish assault. Emperor Cuitlahuac, who had driven the Spanish out on La Noche Triste in June 1520, died of smallpox in November 1520 after just 80 days in power. The disease killed between a third and half of the city's population during the siege of 1521. Cortés's force for the final assault numbered approximately 900 Spaniards against a city that had held 200,000 to 300,000 people before the epidemic. The indigenous allies Cortés recruited had grievances against the Mexica that outweighed their own catastrophic disease losses. Cortés didn't conquer an empire. He followed a biological catastrophe and filed the paperwork claiming credit for what the virus had already decided. 59. The Love Canal neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York, was built on top of a chemical waste disposal site, and the company that deposited the waste explicitly warned the school board in the deed of sale that the land contained chemical deposits and should not be excavated. The school board excavated it. Hooker Chemical had used the Love Canal site from 1942 to 1953, depositing approximately 21,000 tons of chemical waste. In 1953, Hooker sold the site to the Niagara Falls City School Board for $1. The deed included a clause warning of buried chemical waste and limiting the company's liability for any consequences of that waste. The school board built the 99th Street Elementary School directly on the site, breaching the clay cap that had been containing the chemicals. The city then permitted residential housing development around the school. By the 1970s, residents reported chemical odors, black sludge in basement walls, and chemical burns on children playing in yards. President Carter declared a federal emergency in 1978. The site contained 248 different chemicals, including dioxins. Approximately 800 families were relocated. Love Canal is the only major American environmental disaster where the polluter left a written warning in the legal documents that everyone chose to ignore. The deed said, "Don't dig." They dug. 60. Germany placed warning notices in 50 American newspapers on May 1, 1915, the morning the Lusitania departed New York, explicitly stating that ships sailing under Allied flags in the declared war zone were liable to destruction and that travelers did so at their own risk. The Imperial German Embassy paid for the advertisements. They ran the same day as the Lusitania's departure listings. The ship sailed anyway, carrying 1,959 passengers and crew, along with 4.2 million rounds of rifle ammunition, artillery fuses, and other war materiel that Germany had been tracking through shipping manifests. Captain William Turner ignored Admiralty standing orders to zigzag at full speed through the declared war zone and to avoid headlands. The Lusitania was struck by one torpedo on May 7, 1915. A secondary explosion, likely from the war cargo, sank the ship in 18 minutes. 1,198 of the 1,959 aboard died. Germany put the warning in the newspaper. The ship sailed into the zone the warning described. 1,198 people died anyway. The Lusitania disaster managed to be simultaneously advertised in advance and catastrophic in outcome, which is a combination that should be impossible, and demonstrably is not. 61. France built the Maginot Line, and history decided this was the story of generals fighting the last war. Military commanders so fixed on static defense that they couldn't conceive of modern mobile warfare, building a wall while the enemy planned around it. French military planners knew the Maginot Line did not extend to the English Channel. They expected Germany to attack through Belgium and planned to advance French and British forces into Belgium to meet them, which is exactly what they did when Germany invaded in May 1940. The catastrophe came from the specific route. German General Erich von Manstein's plan sent the main armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, which French military doctrine had classified as impassable for armored forces due to the terrain and road network. French General Gamelin left the Ardennes Gap covered by weaker reserve units, while the best Allied formations advanced into Belgium. When German armor crossed the Meuse at Sedan on May 13, 1940, it emerged behind the advancing Allied forces and encircled them at Dunkirk. France fell in 46 days. France didn't fail to think about where Germany would attack. It failed to imagine that anyone would send tanks through terrain its own doctrine called impossible. The Maginot Line's real failure was assuming the enemy had read the same manual. 62. Dr. John Snow's removal of the Broad Street pump handle in September 1854 is one of medicine's foundational heroic narratives. A brilliant physician identifying a contaminated water source, taking decisive action, and stopping a cholera outbreak through scientific reasoning that overturned official dogma. Snow presented his case to the St. James Board of Guardians on September 7th. The board was skeptical. Snow's waterborne theory contradicted official miasma doctrine, but agreed to remove the handle on September 8th. The outbreak's peak had already passed by September 2nd, 6 days before the handle came off, as residents fled the neighborhood in response to the deaths around them. The board replaced the pump handle in November 1854, having not accepted Snow's conclusions about the cause of the outbreak. The official Board of Guardians report rejected the waterborne transmission theory and attributed the decline to other factors. Widespread acceptance of waterborne cholera transmission took another decade of additional evidence. The pump's contamination came from a cesspit located 3 feet from the well casing, a structural defect that was not fixed when the handle was removed or when it was replaced. London didn't stop a cholera outbreak through decisive scientific intervention. It waited for the outbreak to stop itself, gave the credit to a handle, and put the handle back. 63. The American opioid crisis produced an estimated 500,000 overdose deaths between 1999 and 2019, and the origin story involves enough distributed institutional failure that any single decision point seems almost too small to bear that weight. The FDA's approval of OxyContin's labeling as less addictive in 1995 was substantially shaped by a 1980 letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, consisting of one paragraph, 101 words, observing that among hospitalized patients receiving opioids for acute pain, documented addiction was rare. It was not a study. It was an observation letter about a monitored inpatient population. Purdue Pharma and subsequent prescribing literature repeatedly cited this letter as evidence that extended-release opioids posed minimal addiction risk for long-term outpatient pain management, a population and clinical context the letter never examined and never claimed to address. By 2017, the letter had accumulated over 600 citations in medical literature. Purdue Pharma settled for $8.3 billion in 2020. By that point, 500,000 Americans had died. 500,000 people died partially downstream from a 5-sentence observation letter that was never a study, cited as clinical proof of something it never claimed to establish. The opioid crisis is what happens when a paragraph becomes a prescribing framework and nobody checks what the paragraph actually said. 64. Jonestown is shorthand for mass suicide. 918 followers of Jim Jones, who believed so completely in his vision that they willingly drank cyanide-laced punch in Guyana on November 18, 1978, the ultimate demonstration of cult psychology overriding the survival instinct. 304 of the 918 dead were children who could not have made an autonomous decision of any kind. Forensic examinations conducted by Guyanese coroner Dr. Leslie Mutu found injection marks on a significant number of victims' arms and backs, consistent with forcible administration rather than voluntary ingestion. Mutu estimated that approximately 700 of the 918 did not die willingly, based on the physical evidence and body positioning he documented. Survivors who escaped testified that armed guards surrounded the pavilion during the event, and that those who hesitated were physically held down and administered the poison by syringe. Jim Jones himself died from a gunshot wound to the head, not from cyanide. The phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, actually Flavor Aid, entered the English language as a metaphor for dangerous group conformity, based on an event that, for hundreds of its victims, was not conformity. It was murder. The most famous suicide in cult history has a forensic record that calls it something else, and the language we inherited from it is built on the wrong version. 65. Galveston, Texas, September 8, 1900. The hurricane that made landfall that day killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people and remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Cuba's weather service under Father Benito Viñez had been developing sophisticated hurricane tracking systems for decades and had issued warnings about the storm system moving through the Gulf. U.S. Weather Bureau Chief Willis Moore had previously banned the use of Cuban forecasts within the American system, partly from institutional pride and partly from diplomatic tensions with the Spanish-American War's aftermath. Galveston had also been warned years before the storm by engineers, including Isaac Klein, that its position, a barrier island with a maximum elevation of 8.7 feet above sea level, made it catastrophically vulnerable to storm surge. A seawall had been proposed and rejected as unnecessary by civic leaders who did not want the expense or the implication that their city was unsafe. After the storm killed up to 12,000 people, Galveston built a 17-foot seawall and raised the entire island's grade by 17 feet. The deadliest natural disaster in American history killed up to 12,000 people after warnings were blocked by bureaucratic rivalry and infrastructure was rejected as unnecessary. The seawall it needed before the storm was built, using the bodies of the people who drowned without it. 66. The Sampung department store in Seoul collapsed on June 29, 1995, killing 502 people and injuring 937. The building's owner, Lee Jun, had added 2 additional floors to the structure after construction was complete, changed the intended use of the top floor from offices to a heavy restaurant kitchen, moved rooftop HVAC units by dragging them across the roof rather than lifting them, cracking the support columns beneath, and bribed building inspectors who identified problems to sign the approvals anyway. On the morning of collapse, cracks appeared in the ceiling of the 5th floor restaurant at 9 in the morning. Management was informed. The executive offices were evacuated. The store was kept open to customers to avoid losing a day's revenue. The building collapsed at 5:57 in the evening. The people who had been warned and protected themselves left the paying customers inside for 9 hours after the building showed visible signs of imminent structural failure, then watched it fall. Lee Jun was convicted of criminal negligence and bribery. The building did not fail because of unknown structural stresses or unforeseeable loads. It failed because the owner prioritized one afternoon's retail revenue over 502 people, and the inspection system he had purchased allowed him to. Management got out. The customers did not. 67. Nalanda University in present-day Bihar, India operated for approximately 750 years as the most advanced center of learning in the ancient world. 10,000 students, 2,000 teachers, scholars from across Asia, a library complex of 3 buildings housing centuries of accumulated Greek, Persian, and Arabic scholarship. Bakhtiar Khilji's forces destroyed it in 1193, and the Persian chronicler Minhaj-i-Siraj Juzjani's account describes the burning as prolonged and massive. Historical accounts suggest the library burned for 3 months, a duration that, if taken as even partially literal, indicates a collection so vast that it constituted weeks of continuous fuel. Khilji reportedly asked what the buildings contained, and, upon being told they were libraries, declared the contents unnecessary. Whether the 3-month figure is precise chronicle or literary exaggeration about scale, the material result was the same. Centuries of irreplaceable accumulated scholarship erased in a military action whose commander could not read the books he was burning. The greatest university in the ancient world burned for weeks. We don't know with precision what was in it, which is exactly the problem. The destruction was thorough enough that we can't fully inventory what we lost. It took longer to destroy than most military campaigns, and the loss outlasted the empire that caused it. 68. The Ford Pinto's fuel tank was positioned behind the rear axle with 9 inches of crush space, a design that pre-production crash tests flagged as problematic for rear-end collision fire risk. Ford's internal response to this information was a cost-benefit analysis, later known as the Pinto Memo, that calculated the expense of fixing the fuel tank at $11 per vehicle, multiplied by 12.5 million vehicles, totaling $137 million. Against that figure, Ford calculated the estimated cost of paying out litigation from deaths and injuries, using the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's own value of human life figure of $200,000 per death, and arrived at approximately $49.5 million in projected claims. $137 million to fix the tank. $49 million to pay for the deaths. Ford did not fix the tank. Between 1971 and 1978, estimates of Pinto-related fire deaths range from 27 to 500, depending on the methodology. Ford was criminally indicted for reckless homicide in Indiana in 1978, the first time an American corporation faced criminal charges for a product defect. Ford was acquitted. The Pinto didn't have an engineering problem without a solution. It had an accounting solution to an engineering problem, and the accounting was correct until the indictment made it more expensive than the fix. 69. The Russian submarine Kursk sank on August 12, 2000 in the Barents Sea during naval exercises after 2 torpedo explosions, and the story you've absorbed is one of catastrophic technical failure unfolding too rapidly for any realistic rescue window. An estimated 23 sailors survived the initial explosions in the aft compartment. They lived for several hours in darkness and cold, and one of them, Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, wrote notes by flashlight describing the survivors and their situation, dated several hours after the event. Norway and Britain offered rescue assistance within days of the sinking. Russia declined, citing capability and weather, while its own rescue vehicles made repeated unsuccessful attempts to dock with the submarine's rescue hatch. Norwegian divers, when finally permitted access on August 21st, 9 days after the sinking, opened the rescue hatch in a matter of minutes, demonstrating that the technical barrier Russia had cited was not the actual obstacle. All 118 crew members died. The families of the dead were told their relatives had died quickly. Kolesnikov's note proved otherwise. 23 men wrote in the dark waiting for help that was available, offered, and refused for 9 days, while institutional pride processed the optics of accepting foreign assistance. The Kursk is not a story about technical failure. It is a story about what national pride costs when it is applied as a rescue policy. 70. The Exxon Valdez departed the Valdez terminal in Alaska on March 23, 1989, at 9:12 in the evening, carrying 53 million gallons of crude oil. Captain Joseph Hazelwood obtained permission from the Coast Guard to navigate outside the normal shipping lanes to avoid ice, an approved deviation. He then turned navigation control of the supertanker over to third mate Gregory Cousins, who was not certified to navigate that specific passage, and went below to his cabin. The ship struck Bligh Reef at 12:04 in the morning on March 24th. Hazelwood returned to the bridge after the grounding. He had a prior drunk driving conviction and a revoked driver's license that Exxon was aware of when they retained him in command. Blood alcohol testing conducted hours after the grounding produced estimates ranging from 0.06 to 0.19, depending on the methodology used for back calculation. The spill released 11 million gallons of crude oil, contaminating 1,300 miles of Alaskan coastline. Legal proceedings and cleanup costs ran to approximately $3.8 billion. Hazelwood was acquitted of criminal mischief and convicted of negligently discharging oil, fined $50,000, and ordered to perform community service. The largest oil spill in American history happened because the captain handed navigation to an uncertified officer and went to bed. $3.8 billion is an expensive goodnight. 71. The Tuskegee syphilis study began in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama, conducted by the United States Public Health Service on 399 black men with syphilis, who were told they were receiving treatment for a condition called bad blood. In 1947, 15 years into the study, penicillin was confirmed as a highly effective cure for syphilis and became the standard of care. The study continued for 25 more years. Participants were not offered penicillin. They were actively prevented from receiving it. Study administrators contacted local draft boards to ensure that subjects called up for military service during World War II were not treated for syphilis by military physicians. In 1972, Public Health Service employee Peter Buxton leaked the study to journalist Gene Heller. The story ran on July 25, 1972, ending the study after 40 years. By then, 28 men had died directly from syphilis, 100 from related complications, 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. President Clinton formally apologized. In 1997, the U.S. government let 399 men go untreated for syphilis for 25 years after a cure existed and kept meticulous records of their decline. Tuskegee was not a product of ignorance. It was deliberate, documented, and federally funded. 72. The Stanford Prison Experiment of 1971 is in virtually every introductory psychology textbook as definitive proof that ordinary people become cruel authority figures when given institutional power. A landmark finding so alarming that researcher Philip Zimbardo had to stop it after 6 days because the guards became genuinely brutal. Zimbardo did not merely observe the experiment. he served as its prison superintendent, a role that made him an active participant with a stake in the outcome rather than a neutral observer of it. Guard Dave Eshelman later admitted in recorded interviews that he deliberately modeled his behavior on a brutal character from a film and was consciously performing rather than reacting naturally to situational forces. Psychologist Carlo Prescott, a consultant on the study, has stated publicly that he coached the guards before the experiment began on how to behave. A recorded conversation between Zimbardo and a graduate student documents Zimbardo expressing frustration that guards were not being sufficiently harsh and pushing for more. The study was never peer-reviewed through standard journal processes before becoming a textbook cornerstone. A 2019 replication attempt produced significantly less dramatic results. The most famous experiment about how power makes ordinary people cruel was run by a researcher who coached the cruelty he was supposed to be neutrally observing. The Stanford prison experiment didn't prove situational evil. It proved that researchers can find whatever result they decide to look for. 73. Ireland's vulnerability to the potato, blight that arrived in 1844, was not simply a consequence of poverty and colonial land policy, though both contributed. It was an agricultural monoculture problem of almost geometric severity. The entire food supply for millions of people was based on a single potato variety called the Irish lumper, propagated almost entirely by vegetative reproduction rather than seed, meaning it was functionally a population of clones with virtually zero genetic diversity across the whole of the country. Phytophthora infestans, the blight organism that arrived from North America, encountered a crop with no resistant variants to slow its spread because there were no variants at all, just identical copies of the same plant, wall to wall, from one coast to the other. The same blight struck other European countries in the same period and caused damage, but not the same scale of catastrophic collapse, because those countries grew more varied crops and had greater agricultural diversity, serving as biological fire breaks. The Irish lumper's dominance was itself produced by poverty. It yielded the highest calories per acre available to tenant farmers with no land margin and no food security buffer. A civilization's food supply was one plant copied until a single disease could erase all of it at once. The famine's agricultural lesson has since been retaught at industrial scale every time a monoculture fails. 74. Hiram Bingham III is credited with discovering Machu Picchu on July 24, 1911, the heroic explorer uncovering a lost Incan city hidden in the Peruvian cloud forest, one of the great archaeological triumphs of the 20th century. When Bingham arrived at the site, a farmer named Melchor Arteaga was already living and farming there. Arteaga led Bingham to the site for 50 Peruvian cents. Upon arrival, Bingham was greeted by two farming families who had been cultivating the terraces. A German engineer named J.M. von Hassel had referenced the site in a report from 1909, 2 years before Bingham's visit. Agustin Lizarraga, a Peruvian landowner, had carved his name into a stone at the site in 1902, 9 years before Bingham arrived. Bingham's own journals record meeting the resident farmers immediately upon reaching the ruins. What Bingham did was photograph, document, and publicize the site for an international audience, which was genuinely significant work. What he did not do was find something that was lost. Bingham discovered Machu Picchu by paying a local farmer 50 cents to walk him to a place where other people were already living. This is what discovery means in the vocabulary of exploration. Locating something that was never missing, among people who never considered it gone. 75. The Great Wall of China is one of the most celebrated defensive structures in human history. An engineering achievement across 2,000 years of construction, justifying its enormous human cost by protecting China from the northern invasions it was built to prevent. The Mongols entered China under Genghis Khan in 1211 with assistance from a Jurchen ally who opened passage through the Juyong Pass. They did not breach the wall militarily. The Manchu forces who founded the Qing dynasty entered in 1644, when Chinese General Wu Sangui opened the Shanhai Pass gate to their forces after switching sides in a domestic political conflict. They did not breach the wall militarily either. The two most significant northern invasions in Chinese history both came through gates opened by people on the inside. The wall's actual historical utility was primarily economic and administrative, controlling trade routes, taxing goods, regulating population movement, rather than functioning as a military barrier that stopped armies. Various sections were constructed by different dynasties across more than 2,000 years. The Ming Dynasty Wall that tourists visit today cost an estimated 400,000 lives to build. China constructed the longest wall in human history, and the two largest invasions it was built against came through doors that insiders opened. The Great Wall is history's most expensive access control system, defeated repeatedly by the people who held the keys. 76, the 1989 settlement of Bhopal disaster litigation, is described as a landmark moment of corporate accountability. Union Carbide held responsible by the international legal system for one of the worst industrial disasters in human history. Union Carbide settled for $470 million in a deal approved by the Indian Supreme Court over the explicit objections of victims' groups who had sought $3.3 billion. Across an estimated 500,000 to 600,000 people exposed to the toxic gas release, the settlement averaged somewhere between $470 and $1,000 per affected person for injuries ranging from permanent blindness and lung damage to death. The settlement included a clause indemnifying Union Carbide against all future civil and criminal liability in India. Warren Anderson, Union Carbide's CEO at the time of the disaster, was charged with manslaughter by Indian courts, declared a fugitive from Indian justice in 1992, was never extradited despite formal requests, and died in a beach community in Florida in 2014 at the age of 92. Dow Chemical acquired Union Carbide in 2001 and has consistently declined to accept liability or remediate the still contaminated groundwater affecting surrounding communities. Bhopal was settled for the price of a used car per victim. The CEO died of old age. The site is still contaminated 40 years later. This is what accountability looks like when it's measured in hundreds of dollars per body. 77. Thalidomide was approved in West Germany in 1957 and rapidly in 46 other countries as a sedative and anti-nausea medication, including for pregnant women. An estimated 10,000 children were born with severe limb malformations globally as a result. The United States was not among the affected countries, and the reason was one person. Dr. Francis Kelsey, newly appointed to the FDA in 1960, received Richardson Merrill's application for thalidomide approval and found the safety data inadequate, particularly regarding neurological effects, though she had no specific concerns about birth defects at that stage. She returned the application repeatedly as insufficient. The pharmaceutical company applied pressure to Kelsey directly and wrote complaint letters to her supervisors. She continued to refuse approval without sufficient evidence meeting the regulatory standard. When thalidomide's catastrophic effects on fetal development became publicly known in 1961 and 1962, the drug was withdrawn globally. The United States had some limited distribution through physician investigation samples, but no mass market approval. Kelsey received the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service from Kennedy in 1962. 10,000 children in 46 countries were born with severe birth defects, and America was spared because one FDA reviewer kept saying the paperwork wasn't adequate. The most valuable rejection letter in American regulatory history was signed by a woman. The pharmaceutical company was actively trying to have removed from her position. 78. The Torrey Canyon ran aground on Pollard's Rock off Cornwall on March 18, 1967, releasing 117,000 tons of crude oil in the first major supertanker disaster in history. After salvage attempts failed, the British government decided to bomb the wreck to ignite and burn off of the oil. Royal Air Force Buccaneers dropped 42 bombs on the initial runs, and missed the ship on a significant portion of attempts, which should have been a signal about the strategy's precision. The ship was subsequently doused with napalm and aviation fuel to sustain the fire. Wind drove the burning oil on shore, spreading contamination along Cornwall and Brittany's coastlines rather than eliminating it. Approximately 2.5 million liters of chemical dispersant, BP 1002, containing a compound later found to be highly toxic to marine life, were sprayed on the slick as a cleanup measure and proved more destructive to the marine ecosystem than the crude oil itself. An estimated 25,000 seabirds died. Shellfish and marine invertebrate losses across the affected coastlines were extensive. Britain's response to an oil spill was to bomb the oil, miss repeatedly, add napalm, blow the fire on shore, and apply a cleanup chemical more toxic than the original problem. The Torrey Canyon response managed to make a maritime environmental disaster meaningfully worse at every sequential decision point, which takes a specific kind of committed incompetence. 79. The Boeing 737 MAX was involved in 2 fatal crashes: Lion Air Flight 610 in October 2018 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 in March 2019, killing 346 people across both accidents. The aircraft's MCAS flight control system, designed to compensate for handling changes caused by heavier engines mounted further forward on the airframe, activated based on input from a single angle of attack sensor. Boeing had developed an alert called the AOA Disagree Warning Light that would notify pilots when the 2 angle of attack sensors produced conflicting readings. Exactly the condition that triggered the fatal MCAS activations on both accident flights. Boeing made the AOA Disagree alert a paid optional feature. It was part of a package that most airlines, including Lion Air, had not purchased. Boeing's own engineers had flagged the single sensor dependency as a design concern during development. The FAA's certification process delegated significant portions of safety assessment to Boeing itself due to agency resource constraints. The MAX was grounded globally for 20 months following the second crash. 346 people died in 2 crashes, and the warning light that would have told both flight crews what was happening was available for an additional fee that their airlines had not paid. Boeing made the alert that could have prevented the crashes optional. This is what happens when a safety feature becomes a product upsell. 80. Grenfell Tower stood safely for 40 years as a residential high-rise in West London. A 2016 refurbishment replaced its exterior cladding with aluminum composite panels containing a polyethylene core, a material the manufacturer Arconic internally categorized as appropriate for low-rise applications. The fire resistance testing used to approve the cladding for Grenfell's installation was conducted under a standard designed for low-rise building configurations, not for the specific behavior of external cladding on a 24-story residential tower. Documentation subsequently examined during the public inquiry showed that at least some parties involved in the approval process were aware of the distinction between the test standard and the application. The refurbishment cost £8.7 million and replaced original concrete panels that met fire safety standards with cheaper composite panels that did not perform equivalently under high-rise fire conditions. On June 14, 2017, a fire starting on the 4th floor spread to the 24th floor in approximately 15 minutes via the exterior cladding. 72 people died. The public inquiry identified systemic regulatory failure across multiple government bodies over multiple decades. A building that had stood safely for 40 years was refurbished with cheaper panels approved using the wrong test by multiple parties who understood which test was wrong. Grenfell didn't burn because safety standards were absent. It burned because the people applying the standards chose which test counted and chose incorrectly. 81. Starry Most, the Old Bridge of Mostar, was built in 1566 under Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and stood for 427 years as one of the finest examples of Ottoman architecture in the Balkans, spanning the Neretva River in a single elegant arch. Croatian military forces began shelling it specifically and deliberately on November 1st, 1993. They continued for 9 days. It collapsed into the river on November 9th. International observers documented the targeting as deliberate and sustained, not incidental to surrounding combat. Military commanders later acknowledged it was chosen as a target for its symbolic value to Bosniak cultural and national identity. The bridge was not a military installation, but a monument, and its destruction was intended to function as cultural erasure delivered in the form of artillery. General Slobodan Praljak was convicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia for crimes including the bridge's destruction. At his appeals hearing in November 2017, when the conviction was upheld, Praljak drank poison in the courtroom and died. A bridge that had survived a dozen wars across 4 centuries was specifically targeted for 9 days because it meant something to the people on the other side of it. The destruction of Stari Most was not collateral damage. It was cultural annihilation, filed as a military objective, and it took 9 days of deliberate work to accomplish. 82. Roman concrete, opus cementicium, built structures that have survived 2,000 years, including the Pantheon's unreinforced dome and harbor piers still standing in the Mediterranean. The accepted story is that Romans were exceptional builders using techniques that modern engineering has since surpassed. A 2017 study published in American Mineralogist found that Roman seawater concrete actually grows stronger over time because saltwater causes the growth of rare mineral crystals, tobermorite and phillipsite, within the cement matrix, filling microcracks as they form. Modern Portland cement in seawater experiences chemical reactions that cause cracking and deterioration within decades. Roman concrete, in specific marine applications, outperforms the material we replaced it with. The critical ingredient was volcanic ash from specific Italian deposits near Pozzuoli, mixed in precise ratios, combined with seawater and lime. The knowledge was not written in engineering manuals. It lived in the skilled labor guilds that produced it, transmitted through practice and apprenticeship rather than documentation. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD and the guild structures disintegrated with it, the practical knowledge degraded and eventually disappeared. We spent approximately 1,300 years building inferior concrete because the people who knew how to make the better version kept the knowledge in their heads. And then the empire that employed those heads fell. Written documentation exists for a reason, and Rome is the reason. 83. Alfred Nobel invented dynamite, patented it in 1867, and the story you've received is that he was horrified when it was used for military purposes and established the Nobel Peace Prize to atone for unleashing destruction on the world. Nobel explicitly believed that his explosives, dynamite and later ballistite, a smokeless military propellant he sold to the Italian government, would make warfare so catastrophically destructive that nations would stop fighting out of mutual terror. He did not invent dynamite despite its military applications. He marketed military applications actively and believed the technology would function as a deterrent through sheer scale of potential harm, which is an early articulation of what the 20th century would call mutually assured destruction. In 1888, a French newspaper published an obituary for Nobel while he was still alive. His brother had died, and the paper confused them. The obituary called him the Merchant of Death. Nobel read his own premature obituary and did not like the legacy it described. He signed his final will, establishing the Peace Prize in 1895, 1 year before his actual death. The world's most famous Peace Prize was motivated by a man reading his own obituary and deciding he wanted a different one. Nobel didn't create the prize because dynamite caused destruction. He created it because a newspaper told him too early how history would remember him. 84. The Radium Girls painted luminous watch dials at the United States Radium Corporation's factory in Orange, New Jersey from 1917 onward, using paint containing radium that glowed in the dark. They were instructed to point their brushes with their lips to achieve the fine tip needed for precise work, a technique that required putting the brush, and with it, radium paint, into their mouths with each stroke. Company scientists working in the same facility used tongs to handle radium samples and worked behind lead screens. The protective measures applied to the scientists who understood the material were not applied to the women on the production floor who were ingesting it. When workers began developing jaw necrosis, severe anemia, and spontaneous bone fractures, conditions caused by radium accumulating in bone tissue and irradiating from within, company physicians initially diagnosed unrelated ailments. Company doctor Frederick Flynn examined sick workers and declared them healthy. The company subsequently sued to delay litigation and exhaust legal options before the women, many of whom were dying, could access their rights in court. The case eventually established the legal principle of corporate responsibility for occupational disease and influenced the formation of occupational safety regulation. The radium girls did not die from ignorance about radiation. They died because the company applied its radiation knowledge very precisely by job title, and theirs was the wrong one. 85. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed the United States House of Representatives 416-0 and the Senate 88-2 on August 7, 1964, authorizing military escalation in Vietnam that would eventually deploy 543,000 American troops and kill an estimated 2 million to 3 million Vietnamese civilians, alongside 58,000 American service members. The resolution was passed in response to two reported North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. naval vessels. The first attack, August 2nd, occurred during a covert American intelligence operation against North Vietnamese coastal installations and is documented. The second attack, August 4th, almost certainly did not happen. Captain John Herrick, commanding the vessels that reported being under attack, sent a cable shortly after his initial report, stating, "Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings." President Johnson received both Herrick's initial attack report and his doubt cable before presenting Congress with the attack as confirmed. Secretary of Defense McNamara later acknowledged in his memoir that the second attack most probably did not occur. Congress voted 416-0 to escalate a war based on an attack the reporting captain had already questioned in writing the same night, in a cable the president had already read. 86. The sinking of the German battleship Bismarck in May 1941 is framed as a triumph of Royal Navy tactical pursuit. Britain's most capable warships relentlessly hunting down and destroying the ship that had sunk HMS Hood and killed 1,415 of her crew 4 days earlier. The Bismarck was nearly home. It had repelled and damaged British vessels in pursuit and was within range of air cover from occupied France when Swordfish torpedo biplanes from HMS Ark Royal attacked on May 26th. The Swordfish was a fabric-covered aircraft from the 1930s, flying at approximately 90 miles per hour. The first attack wave accidentally targeted the British cruiser HMS Sheffield instead of the Bismarck. The second wave scored 2 hits, one on the belt armor with no significant effect, and one on the rudder, jamming it at 15 degrees to port. The Bismarck began circling uncontrollably. Her captain transmitted to Hitler that the ship was unmaneuverably and they would fight to the last shell. She was finished by gunfire and torpedoes on May 27th. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft fire control systems were too sophisticated to calculate a targeting solution for an aircraft flying that slowly. The most feared battleship in the world was defeated by a fabric biplane, landing one lucky torpedo on the 1 square yard that ended the entire equation. 87. The Easter Rising of April 1916 is taught as a carefully planned Irish Republican insurrection. Bold revolutionaries seizing the moment while Britain was distracted by the First World War, a coordinated military action that catalyzed Irish independence. The rising was nearly canceled entirely, and then it was canceled, and then a faction did it anyway. The Aoud, a German ship carrying 20,000 rifles for the rebellion, was intercepted by the Royal Navy on April 21st and scuttled by its captain rather than surrender the weapons. IRB leader Ian McNeill, upon learning the extent of the arms failure and that a police raid on Republican leadership was imminent, published a countermanding order in the Sunday Independent on April 23rd, canceling mobilization nationwide. The order ran in the newspaper. Patrick Pierce and the Military Council decided to proceed regardless on Easter Monday with whatever forces actually appeared. Approximately 1,200 rather than the planned thousands, 1 day later than scheduled, without the weapons, after their own cancellation notice had run in the press. The rising lasted 6 days. 485 people died. The British government's subsequent execution of 16 leaders transformed Irish public opinion more decisively than the Rising itself had. The revolution that created modern Ireland went ahead after its own leader published the cancellation, and the British response did more for independence than the rebels did. 88, Centralia, Pennsylvania, has been on fire since May 27, 1962, when the Borough Council authorized burning refuse in an old strip mine pit as part of routine waste disposal. A common practice at the time that nobody checked against the subsurface geology directly beneath the pit. The pit connected to an abandoned mine vein that had not been properly sealed from the underlying coal seam network. Fire entered the seams. Early extinguishing attempts in the years following used trenching and flushing methods, but were repeatedly abandoned mid-project due to inadequate funding allocations and bureaucratic delays between municipal, state, and federal jurisdictions arguing about financial responsibility. By 1979, carbon monoxide was being detected inside residents' homes. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy fell into a sinkhole that opened beneath him in his own backyard due to mine subsidence from the fire burning below. Congress allocated $42 million for evacuation in 1983. The population dropped from 1,000 residents to approximately 5 today. The underground coal seam contains enough fuel to sustain combustion for an estimated 250 more years. A Pennsylvania borough has been on fire for over 60 years because someone lit a trash pit without checking whether it connected to a coal mine underneath it. Centralia is what we'll deal with it later, looks like when later is measured in centuries of burning geology. 89, Mikhail Gorbachev is credited, or blamed depending on the framing, with ending the Soviet Union, and the story presents this as a deliberate political choice by a leader who understood the system was unsalvageable and engineered its dissolution. Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika policies were designed explicitly to modernize and preserve the Soviet system, not to dismantle it. He maintained the Communist Party's constitutional leading role until 1990, under sustained pressure to relinquish it. He consistently opposed dissolution of the USSR and hoped until the final weeks for a reformed confederation, rather than the fragmentation that occurred. The August 1991 coup attempt by communist hardliners, conducted specifically to reverse his reforms, fatally undermined both Gorbachev's personal authority and the party's institutional legitimacy simultaneously. Boris Yeltsin's response to the coup, standing on a tank in Moscow and rallying resistance, transferred political momentum to the Russian Federation rather than to the reformed Union Gorbachev had envisioned. The Soviet Union was formally dissolved on December 25, 1991. Gorbachev stated repeatedly in subsequent years that he deeply regretted the dissolution and never intended it as an outcome. The man who ended the Soviet Union was trying to save it. Gorbachev ran the most consequential, unintended organizational dissolution in modern history. A leader who ordered a renovation and accidentally scheduled the demolition instead. 90, Krakatoa erupted on August 26th and 27th, 1883, producing the loudest sound in recorded human history. Estimated at 172 decibels at 160 kilometers. Audible in Australia, 4,800 kilometers away, and on Rodriguez Island, 4,600 kilometers in the other direction. The eruption itself did not kill most of the 36,000 people who died. The tsunamis it generated, reaching heights of up to 30 meters along the coasts of Java and Sumatra, destroyed 165 coastal villages and killed the vast majority of the dead in the hours following the main eruption. The Dutch colonial administration operated a tide gauge system in the region that recorded wave activity as it propagated. There was no early warning network connecting those measurements to the coastal population centers that the waves were approaching. The monitoring infrastructure existed. The communication infrastructure between the monitoring and the people in the path did not. The eruption cooled global temperatures by approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius for the following year, producing vivid red and orange sunsets documented in paintings and diaries worldwide through 1883 and 1884, including, most probably, the sky in Edvard Munch's The Scream. Krakatoa is the 19th century's version of an alert notification routed to an unmanned inbox, with 36,000 people downstream of the unread message. 91, the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806 is framed as a triumph of American frontier exploration. Two skilled captains and their corps of discovery opening the West through military discipline, scientific preparation, and the determination to map what had never been mapped by Europeans. The expedition survived primarily because Native American nations repeatedly intervened to prevent it from failing. The Shoshone provided the horses essential for crossing the Rocky Mountains in September 1805, without which the Corps faced winter in the mountains without the means to cross them. The Nez Perce fed the Corps when they were near starvation after the Bitterroot crossing, nursed sick members back to health, cached the Corps' canoes for the return journey, and provided guides through unmapped terrain. The Clatsop provided food through the brutal 1805 to 1806 winter at the Pacific coast. Sacagawea recognized territory near her homeland and corrected the route. Her presence traveling with an infant signaled to other nations that the expedition was not a war party, preventing hostile engagements that might otherwise have ended it. Lewis acknowledged in his own journals that without native assistance, the expedition could not have succeeded. Lewis and Clark didn't discover the American West. They were given an extended guided tour of it by the people who already lived there and had for generations. 92, the 2008 financial crisis gets classified as a systemic failure, too complex and distributed for any single point of accountability. Sophisticated financial instruments operating beyond the capacity of regulators to understand in real time, a collapse that only became legible in retrospect. The credit rating agencies whose function was to assess the safety of the mortgage-backed securities at the center of the crisis were paid by the banks whose products they were rating. This conflict of interest was not concealed. It was the openly operating structure of the ratings industry, documented in regulatory filings, discussed in industry publications, and debated in policy circles for years before the collapse. By 2006, Moody's revenues from structured finance rating, the specific product category that failed, had grown from $61 million in 1996 to $869 million. Internal emails produced during subsequent investigations show agency analysts aware that the ratings were unsustainable. One Standard & Poor's analyst wrote in 2006, "Let's hope we are all wealthy and retired by the time this house of cards falters." The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission's 2011 report identified the rating agencies as essential components of the collapse. The agencies paid to warn the world the financial system was unstable were paid by the financial system to say it was fine. $2 to $4 trillion in global wealth losses is the invoice for that arrangement. 93, the dodo went extinct within 25 years of Dutch colonists establishing permanent settlement on Mauritius in 1638. And the story that reached you is one of sailors eating a naive, defenseless bird into oblivion. A flightless creature with no fear of humans, hunted to extinction because it wouldn't run. Contemporary accounts of dodo meat are frequently negative. Dutch officer Wybrand van Warwijk described the birds as disgusting and noted they were consumed only from necessity when better provisions were unavailable. The primary driver of dodo extinction was the population of invasive animals that Dutch settlers introduced to Mauritius: rats, pigs, cats, and macaques, which ate dodo eggs and competed aggressively for the food sources ground-nesting birds depended on. A 2017 study found that dodo bones showed seasonal patterns of mass fluctuation consistent with adapted behavior rather than naive helplessness. The birds had behavioral responses to their island environment that were simply not calibrated for mammalian predators, because their island had never had any. The dodo's tameness around humans was not stupidity. It was a rational behavioral adaptation to an environment without ground-level threats, made catastrophically irrelevant the moment humans arrived with animals the island's entire ecology had never encountered. The dodo didn't go extinct because sailors ate them. It went extinct because the rats that came ashore with the sailors ate the eggs. 94, Gavrilo Princip fired the shots that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, triggering the diplomatic cascade that became the First World War. The version of this story that circulates presents Princip as a hardened political operative dispatched by Serbian nationalist organizations to execute a sophisticated targeted killing. Princip was 19 years and 11 months old at the time, technically a minor under Austrian law, which is why he was not executed after his arrest. He had traveled to Belgrade to join Serbian resistance movements and had been turned away from the Black Hand organization, specifically because he was too small and too physically weak. He weighed approximately 50 kilograms. He was part of a loosely organized Bosnian student nationalist group, not a professional assassination cell. After the first bomb attempt by another conspirator failed that morning, Princip believed the mission was over. He had given up. He was eating at a delicatessen when Franz Ferdinand's car made a wrong turn and stopped directly in front of him. He stepped forward and fired twice from 5 feet. He was arrested immediately. He died in an Austrian prison on April 28, 1918, of tuberculosis of the bone, weighing under 40 kilograms, almost certainly before understanding the full scale of what those 2 shots had produced. The man who started the 20th century's defining catastrophe had already been told he wasn't qualified for the job. 95, the Bermuda Triangle disappears more ships and planes than any comparable stretch of ocean, or so the story goes. The zone between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico has accumulated a mythology of anomalous disappearances dense enough to sustain a publishing industry across 5 decades. Lloyd's of London, which insures ships and has strong financial incentives to identify genuinely dangerous ocean regions, does not charge higher premiums for vessels transiting the Bermuda Triangle, and does not classify it as a special area of navigational concern. The U.S. Coast Guard officially states it does not recognize the Bermuda Triangle as having unusual characteristics warranting specific advisory status. The myth was substantially constructed by author Charles Berlitz's 1974 book, which sold 20 million copies across 30 languages, by including ships that disappeared outside the triangle's geographic boundaries, attributing all disappearances to mysterious causes without investigating prosaic explanations, and omitting the considerably larger number of vessels that crossed the same waters without incident. The North Sea, a smaller and shallower body of water with comparably heavy traffic, records a higher absolute rate of maritime incidents. Most disappearances attributed to the triangle have documented explanations involving weather, equipment, and navigation when examined without the supernatural frame. The Bermuda Triangle is what a 1974 paperback does to geography when nobody fact-checks the appendix. The check has been uncashed for 50 years, and the triangle has stayed mysterious on schedule. 96. Medieval Europeans believed the Earth was flat. The Church suppressed knowledge of its spherical shape, and it took brave explorers like Columbus to prove otherwise against the weight of entrenched religious opposition. This is the version of history that appeared in your school textbook and is almost entirely invented. The spherical Earth was established Greek knowledge. Pythagoras proposed it. Aristotle provided physical arguments for it in On the Heavens in 350 BC. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy around 240 BC. Thomas Aquinas taught the spherical Earth in the 13th century. Roger Bacon calculated its circumference in the same period. Columbus's actual dispute with the Spanish court scholars was about the Earth's size, not its shape. Specifically, Columbus believed the distance to Asia by sailing west was approximately 4,400 kilometers. It is 19,600. He was catastrophically wrong and would have died at sea if the Americas had not been in the way. The flat Earth myth was largely manufactured in the 19th century, popularized by Washington Irving's fictionalized 1828 biography of Columbus and Andrew Dixon White's 1896 polemic. The myth that medieval people believed in a flat Earth was invented by 19th century writers arguing about the relationship between science and religion, inserted into school curricula, and has been taught as history ever since. A historical fiction about a historical fiction in every classroom long enough to become the thing it was invented to mock. 97. The Salem witch trials of 1692 killed 20 people and imprisoned hundreds more through a process of accusation, spectral evidence, and Puritan legal proceedings that collapsed in on itself within a year. The accepted explanation is mass hysteria, compounded by religious extremism. A community consumed by fear and superstition, executing its own members on the testimony of people describing invisible torments. Ethnobotanist Linda Caporal proposed in 1976, and subsequent researchers have examined and partially supported the hypothesis that the accuser's physical symptoms, convulsions, hallucinations, crawling skin sensations, temporary blindness, and muscle spasms match the documented symptom profile of ergotism, caused by the fungus Claviceps purpurea growing on rye grain and producing compounds including lysergic acid, a chemical precursor to LSD. The Salem area had conditions favorable to ergot growth in 1692, a wet spring followed by a warm summer. The accuser's households were concentrated in the western part of Salem village, which had swampier land used for rye cultivation. The accusations began in winter, when stored rye from the previous harvest would be consumed, and subsided in summer. Social, political, and economic factors were also substantial contributors, and historians continue to debate the relative weight. 20 people may have been executed, partly because someone's rye harvest grew a fungus. The Salem witch trials might be history's most consequential bad grain, a mass hallucination with a body count that shaped American legal precedent. 98. The Panama Canal's construction under American direction, completed in 1914, is celebrated as one of the great engineering achievements in human history. The challenge of cutting through the continental divide, overcome by American industrial capacity and organizational determination. The French attempt to build the same canal, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps from 1881 to 1889, failed primarily because yellow fever and malaria killed an estimated 22,000 workers in 8 years. De Lesseps had built the Suez Canal without encountering this problem and did not adapt his approach to the radically different disease environment of Panama. The French company went bankrupt in 1889, in part due to the cost of disease-related workforce attrition that no engineering solution addressed. The United States took over in 1904. Physician William Gorgas, applying Walter Reed's 1900 discovery that yellow fever was transmitted by Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, implemented a systematic eradication campaign, eliminating standing water, screening water containers, fumigating buildings, and draining swamps. Yellow fever was declared eliminated from the canal zone by November 1905, before the major excavation work had even properly begun. The subsequent decade of engineering proceeded in an environment where the disease that had stopped France was gone. 2 countries tried to build the same canal. The one that arrived with medicine built it. The Panama Canal was won by mosquito control, and the engineering came after. 99. the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, killed an estimated 140,000 and 70,000 people, respectively. And the justification you've received is that they were necessary to prevent a land invasion of Japan that would have killed far more people on both sides. Declassified American documents complicate this framing significantly. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, completed in 1945 using captured Japanese records and direct interviews with Japanese officials, concluded that Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned. American intelligence was intercepting and decrypting Japanese diplomatic cables, showing Japan's ambassador to Moscow was authorized to seek peace terms. Japan's stated condition, preservation of Emperor Hirohito's position, was ultimately granted in the final surrender document anyway, after 200,000 civilians were killed. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8th between the two bombings, which Japanese leadership records indicate was a significant shock to their strategic calculation. American casualty estimates for a land invasion ranged from 20,000 in pre-bomb War Department assessments to the 500,000 to 1 million figures cited in later public justifications for the decision. The evidence that Japan was actively seeking an exit before the bombs fell is not classified anymore. What was done with that search is the part history keeps arguing about. 100. Australia was declared terra nullius, land belonging to nobody. When the first fleet arrived in 1788, a legal doctrine that classified the continent as legally unoccupied and available for British settlement without treaty or purchase. Australia was home to an estimated 300,000 to 750,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the time of first contact, organized into approximately 500 distinct nations with complex systems of land management, governance, trade, and law that had sustained continuous civilization on the continent for at least 65,000 years. British officials, including Governor Arthur Phillip, encountered sophisticated societies immediately and documented them. Terra nullius was applied not because the land was literally empty, it demonstrably was not, but on the legal theory that Aboriginal people did not practice European-style fixed agriculture or hold property in a form recognizable under British law. The doctrine was not a conclusion drawn from evidence. It was a political determination made because the evidence pointed the other way, and the alternative, treaty negotiation with existing sovereign nations, was slower and more expensive than declaring the land unoccupied. Terra nullius was not overturned in Australian law until the Mabo versus Queensland High Court decision in 1992, 204 years after settlement. Britain declared a continent with 500,000 people living in 500 nations empty because the people there didn't farm in a way that was legally convenient to recognize. The finding was always false. The law just took 2 centuries to say so. 101. Y2K produced nothing when the calendar rolled to January 1st. 2000. No infrastructure collapse. No banking failures. No grid outages. And the consensus that formed almost immediately was that the entire panic had been irrational, that the warnings were always overblown, that the technology industry had manufactured a crisis to justify consulting fees, and that the whole episode demonstrated how easily the public could be stampeded by hypothetical technical threats. An estimated $300 to $600 billion was spent globally on Y2K remediation before the date arrived. Countries and industries that invested less in remediation experienced actual infrastructure failures on January 1st. 2000, Gambia's medical equipment malfunctioned. Japanese nuclear plant monitoring systems generated processing errors. Banking systems in several developing nations encountered failures. The U.S. Defense Department identified 2,750 mission-critical systems as non-compliant and fixed them before the date. The Gartner Group and other post-event analysts consistently found that the level of disruption on January 1st correlated inversely with the level of remediation investment made beforehand. The absence of disaster was the result of the work, not evidence that the work was unnecessary. Y2K was the only disaster in history where success was universally interpreted as proof the threat was never real. The people who spent $300 billion preventing a catastrophe were mocked by the people whose catastrophe they prevented. This is what successful infrastructure maintenance looks like: invisible, expensive, and completely indistinguishable from the problem having never existed. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.